I do want to start off with something that may be somewhat of a familiar career. So we're going to start with Chariot Riders. It goes without saying that people don't really remember that there's places outside of Europe when it comes to the medieval ages, and they never come up in conversation. The Byzantine Empire had existed since 395, and it ended when the medieval era did in 1453. And one high-paced, action-packed, yet wildly dangerous job that was flexing the great wealth and progress of the empire was chariot racing, which differed from modern horse racing or even NASCAR racing. You were exposed, the chariots had no backs, and you were standing without any seatbelts or restraints to keep you from flying off. You could be smashed against the stone pillars, dragged to your death behind your own horses. The appeal of racing for the fans appeared to be the same as the modern fans: testosterone, adrenaline, bloodshed, and gambling. Racers, meanwhile, had the potential for a fortune and their freedom. Because that's what made the job suck, its chariot riders weren't free men. And knowing you could win 15 bags of gold, yeah, you're gonna kill any other racer who tries to get in your way, because if you lose, you're just going back to hard labor. There were 4 teams in the Byzantine chariot racing: the whites, the greens, the blues, and the reds. Eventually these teams merged and it just became the greens and the blues, and the fans were so passionate about the sport that when they weren't throwing nail-studded tablets under the track to sabotage opponents, they were breaking into bloody brawls to support their own team. And now, on the complete flip side, in primitive medieval Europe, a job called flatulist. As someone who reads and writes about history all day, every day, I really do have a hard time with how the Europeans got so high and mighty and dubbed everyone else primitive when they literally lived like it was the New Jersey's public landfill and had the humor to match. So yeah, believe it or not, royals would actually employ an individual called a flatulist to entertain crowds sigh by farting. These individuals would pass gas in what they called amusing manners, such as to music or even on certain cues to get big laughs. Irish gas performers were called bracetors instead of flatulists. St. Augustine, of all people, once wrote about flatulists, saying that they possess such a command of their bowels and can break wind continuously at will so as to produce the effect of singing. As if it couldn't get more weirdly infuriating, some flatulists were actually considered celebrities of their time. One was Roland the Farter, who performed for Henry II's court annually. After several years, Henry rewarded him with 30 acres of land, a giant manor, for his skilled entertainment. Let's hear about how these old ladies would just you're healed. In ancient and medieval Europe, a group of wise women who were mostly elderly would give insight into medical issues primarily concerning the female body that the male counterparts had yet to grasp. And some of these homeopathic healers would actually spit on young ladies 3 times in order to protect them from the evil eye. Talk about a weird job, huh? This custom of spitting opens up a wide subject. Not only is it practiced in the hope of obtaining good fortune for the spittee, but amongst all ages and almost all people, it being considered as an act to safeguard the spitter as well. According to Theocritus, amongst the ancient Greeks and Romans, the most common remedy against an invidious look was spitting. It was hence called despure malum. It is necessary to spit 3 times into the breast of the person who fears fascination. Invidious look and fascination is in reference to the evil eye. Old women were accustomed to avert the evil eye from children by spitting onto their own bosoms. And among the ancient Greeks, where this tradition even came from, it was customary to do the triple spit into your own bosom at the sight of someone with a condition or ailment you wish not to be stricken with. Leprosy, maybe they're a madman, maybe they're struggling with epilepsy. This act was done in defiance of the omen, and spitting is known to be a sign of aversion, bidding it not come into their life as it had to the individual stricken with it. These spitting grannies were some of the first women hunted because they were believed to be evil sorceresses and witches. Because if farting wasn't entertainment, animal eviscerations were. Meet the bear leaders, an unusual historical profession involving exactly what the name describes, literally leading bears from village to village. Bears were mostly used for blood sports like bear baiting, in which packs of dogs were set to fight against the bear. You can imagine how that'd go. Both Henry IV and Elizabeth I were famously fans of that horrific bloodshed, and by the Tudor era, increasing numbers of bear pits or bear gardens were constructed in major cities. Bear leaders allowed villagers to enjoy entertainment of the big city bear baiting fights in the comfort of their own homes. Incidentally, by the 18th century, the term bear leader actually came to refer to a different profession altogether. They were literally tutor and babysitter hybrids who were hired by parents to keep boisterous, young noble sons under control and out of trouble, particularly during the Grand Tour. What's that mean? Taking care of crappy noble child was the same as handling bears. So let me think. Leading bears from city to city making money in the medieval era, or raising a spoiled entitled child in an era where there's no water washing the snot off their face or the stickiness off their fingers. Bear, I'll take the bear. Can I get some bears over here? Bear, yeah. Here's one that's still a job to this day, adult adoptee. Japan's birth rate is probably worse than that of a nunnery, but they do have the second largest adoption rate, 90% of which is in between two adult Japanese men. This is often because the older man's employee or their pre-existing son-in-law, who could then agree per contract to take the name of his now sister wife, but they can be flexible negotiators in a son search. For example, if the younger man still has a starter pack parents, the older man will happily offer those parents a buyout. If their new hand-picked son is already married, they'll also just adopt his wife as part of the package deal. Like most hardcore Japanese business practices, this weird form of feudal meritocracy can be traced back to the age of medieval samurai. For centuries, Japanese nobles would seek out competent young men to audition for who wants to be the next clan heir. And nowadays, major companies like Mitsubishi, Toyota, and Canon have actually been handed over to former CEOs' adopted children. The practice of using adoption to pick the next paterfamilias was also popular with the ancient Roman nobility. An example being the first proper emperor, Augustus aka Octavian. He was only a distant relative of Julius Caesar until he was adopted in the dead dictator's will to continue the hostile takeover of Rome. But the European practice of adult adoption existed and then was wiped out by the new feudal nobility during the medieval ages. Not because they wanted to create a more competitive market for baby orphans. After all, how would the church get its free labor if not by people dropping them off on their steps? On the contrary, these Christian rulers banned adoption altogether, believing nobody deserves to be part of a good family unless they slid into that privilege on a wave of nepotism and discarded placenta.
In our number 5 spot today, we have the executioner. We've all heard of this job before. After all, an important aspect of the medieval times was the fact that they were trying to have better criminal law enforcement, which naturally meant that a ton of people were getting executed for their crimes. While there is of course now the stereotype of people who did this work as being these huge, hooded, evil people, history shows that this stereotype is largely untrue. Most of the people who fell into this job didn't come into it because they wanted to. In fact, most people of course saw this job as being undesirable, but the job usually was bestowed upon them. Sometimes butchers were called for the job because of relevant experience, other times it was criminals who could either do the job or face their own death sentence, and most commonly, people found themselves in the job because their fathers had been executioners before them. Aside from the nitty-gritty of the job, I mean the horrors of the work itself, it's obvious, another part of being an executioner that sucked was the fact that people didn't really want to associate with you. Executioners were usually on the fringes of society and outcast, sometimes even forced to actually live on the edge of town. In our number 4 spot today, we have catgut. Back in the medieval times, they didn't have the technology we have now, or even the technology that was available in the 17th century when it came to making strings for instruments such as the violin, but they still did have violins around, so how? Well, in comes the invention of catgut, which thankfully is not made of cat guts, but it is made of sheep's guts. Okay, really had you in the first half there. Violin string makers during this time would make the strings by basically twisting strands of sheep innards together. Their job would require them to butcher the animal in a very careful way, making sure not to rupture the stomach or the lower intestines. The process could take hours just to get the required materials from the animal. The insides then needed to be soaked in a wood ash solution for a good cleaning, but they needed to be monitored at all times to ensure that they weren't beginning to spoil, which is horrible. From here, the drying process began, and after that, it was time for twistin'. In our number 3 spot today, we have the rat catcher. Another job that really is just what it sounds like. Rat catchers had quite a busy time during the medieval times. There was a rat problem, and these rats were filthy and full of disease, and someone needed to catch them. Castles were often filled with extra grain, vegetables, and herbs in the case of emergency, and this led to the perfect environment for rats and mice. Even before the connections were drawn between rats and disease, people hated them, and this is because they would eat your food. A bad had rat infestation for a person without much actually could have been a death sentence for them during this time. This meant that people really appreciated rat catchers in society, although the job wasn't a great one, was clearly risky, and also was largely ineffective. Rat catchers would sometimes try and use spells, sometimes they would use herbs as a sort of poison, and sometimes they'd even use the good old leave the body as a warning to the other rats trick. Yeah, wonder why it didn't work. In our number 2 spot today we have the treadmill operator. This is a job that sucked during the medieval times because it was boring, it's basically like a human hamster wheel, but also because it was incredibly dangerous and not for those who were afraid of heights. Treadmill operators would normally be placed at the highest point of a structure, and the wheel they were stepping on was the top half of like a pulley system to help things be hoisted up as they were building said, structure that they're at the top of. This is a practice that started in ancient Rome and was reintroduced in the Middle Ages. This was actually a job that was commonly given to people who were blind because the fear of heights dissuaded a lot of people from doing this job, which only makes it probably more dangerous. In our number 1 spot today we have the lime burner. Lime mortar has been a common and important building material for years, stemming back to the 1st century BC, but despite its importance, it's not exactly easy to work with. In order to use it, you need to remove the carbon monoxide from the calcium-rich stone, and this was the job of a lime burner. They needed to take the stone and heat it in a kiln at around 800 degrees Celsius. Sounds easy enough for sure, except for the fact that the job meant that you were constantly being exposed to rooms full of carbon monoxide and dust chalk that was capable of removing your ability to breathe. And also, just to top it all off, there's also a high risk that once the stone was done heating, it might also explode if it comes into contact with water. So better hope none of your sweat drips down onto it or else things are not good.
Number 10, divorce. Today, divorces can go either which way. Way 1, it's a brutal, awful experience for everyone around you. Words are exchanged, property is fought over, and by the end, 2 lawyers are a couple grand richer, and now the kids get to say dad's house and mom's house. Wow, sounds awful. Or it can be a more pleasant experience where both parties mutually agree it's no longer working out, and they do their best to have a peaceful separation on everyone's behalf. That's nice, and it does happen sometimes. Well, medieval marriage and divorce looked a lot different. Who would have thought? 800 years ago, who would have thought? The main part of divorce really was just being the annulment of the marriage, assuming it was allowed. Rules changed depending on when and where it was. Whereas today, like my long-winded joke at the top of this segment, there's much to consider in a divorce, especially the estate. It's probably the main thing is the stuff. It's all about the stuff. The marriage itself is the least of people's worries today. But back then, it was just about just not being married anymore. I want the bricks in the house. Like, what are you gonna, in medieval times, what are you gonna fight over? Like, I want the cows is mine. Number 9, off with the head. Another way to solve the issue of divorce and marriage was to get rid of your spouse. The same way Polly Walnuts got rid of Mikey Palmis. Gabish? You know what I'm saying? Most famously, King Henry VIII dispatched a few of his wives as the church really gave him no other way out of the marriages he found himself in. So, off with the head. However, I think it's important to note that King Henry wasn't the only bloated throne sitter to have his wives dealt with soprano style. Things weren't exactly fair for women back then, or at all. Least of all, the law. It didn't have everyone's best interest and justice in mind, especially women, so there was a good chance that if the king didn't like you, you were gone. Happened all over. Number 8, adultery. There you were, standing like a wallflower at your town's clubhouse. Ours was called the Lions Club. You know what I'm talking about, small towns. Wearing a little old thing your sister lent you. Cowboy boots clatter as the music gets quieter. Then a handsome young man wearing jeans all over took you by the hand. Oh, romantic. You've been together ever since. I'm sure I literally just nailed that for some people. That's pretty much how they're married now. Except now he's not as charming. Now he's got a beer gut and he farts in his sleep. Ugh. Oh well, that's married life. I'm sure the medieval people went through a very similar process. What am I getting at? Well, when you get married, it means you're with that person forever. That includes the bedroom. Well, kings and queens of ye olde times ignored that rule. Besides the obvious political reasons for marrying, which I'll get to later, what was the point of marrying for love if you're just gonna have 30 mistresses or a secret lover? I would list the kings and queens who partook in this, but it would simply be easier to list those that didn't partake in that. You know what I mean though? What's the point? What's the whole point of doing it if you're just gonna, yes, we'll love you together forever, and then, how you doing? It just doesn't make any sense. Number 7, soldier on trial. Things weren't all bad for ladies back in medieval times. Sometimes they were given the benefit of the doubt, like in medieval France for example, where if a woman did desire a divorce, there was a non-violent way to get one. She and her husband would meet in front of a group for proceedings regarding their marital prowess in the bedroom. Of course, why else would I be talking about it? Meaning she had to prove that he could not prove himself a man in the bedroom. Happens to a lot of guys. In a nutshell, that means a group of people would handle, grab, stare, and examine a man's gabagool, pichadillo, sausage, Woody the Woodpecker, the olive branch, the Edmund Fitzgerald, the ballpark hot dog, the ambassador, the trombone, the one-eyed Bob, and the heat-seeking trouser rocket. That's a You guys get the point. It was a very embarrassing process, but if he couldn't produce results in front of prying eyes, then, well, that means she's leaving. Do you imagine that? Number 6, no Irish grandma. In society, we've decided that there are rules and laws, and rules that really just need to be followed in order to have an effective society, like no harming others or laws that help keep us safe. However, there are some laws that just don't need to be said. Some rules are self-explanatory, like no diving in shallow water. Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to hurt yourself. No pooping in public. Of course not. I would never. I promise. And you can't marry your nan. That's right, you can't marry your nan. Yes, that's right. A law from medieval Ireland hits us with a marriage law stating that no man shall marry the wife of his granddad. You see, that's when you didn't have to tell us. We knew that. I knew that. Everybody knew that. Marriage laws were changing at the time because of English rule, and a lot of other laws were changing too, but the close family nature of their marriages, well, things get a little confusing. It was just about the time. I'm not allowed to say I don't think, but it was that's what it was. So they were changing laws, but it was kind of gross. Ugh. Now I feel gross talking about it.
And what makes all of this so much better is that you never have a second alone. If you haven't caught onto the theme here yet, it is plain and simple. Castle life meant cramped quarters. It took a lot of people to keep a castle running. There were cooks, cleaners, guards, personal servants, and of course all the royalty as well. Plus, the royals that lived in the castle extended past the nuclear family. It was their extended families as well. As a result, most of the rooms were multifunctional, and the keep was the primary living space in the castle. Soldiers, servants, and even lords and ladies-in-waiting were expected to sleep in groups segregated by the sexes. For example, the women may have slept in bedchambers while the male servants, courtiers, and soldiers may have slept in the Great Hall. Even lords and ladies of castles often shared a room with a servant of the same sex. So, why is that gross? Religious and royal obligation to reproduce. Also, people without an obligation who would really like to do it anyway. As long as those people are married, you actually couldn't complain. In fact, it's weirder if you saw something and said something. So if everything stinks and you got next to no windows, how do you make a minty fresh castle? The simple answer is they didn't. Mold, insect, vermin, and disease were all part of everyday life in medieval times. Fresh water was precious and a reliable disinfectant was yet to be discovered. Eating a little bit of mold on your food or stepping in rooms with moldy walls were minor problems compared to actually finding enough food to eat and fighting off hungry wild animals like wolves, or not dying of the plague, or not being accused of witchcraft. There's bigger fish to fry. People in Norman and Tudor England lived short lives. If you reached the age of 40, you were considered old. Castles were very difficult to keep clean. There was no running water, so even simple washing tasks meant carrying lots of bucketfuls of water from a well or a stream. Few people had the luxury of being able to bathe regularly. The community back then was generally more tolerant of smell as a result. Inside the castle walls, floor coverings consisted of straw rushes, and later, sweet-smelling herbs like lavender and mint. This could be swept away and replaced when it was of a noticeable point of filth. It was said that an ancient collection of beer, grease, fragments, bones, spittle, excrement of dogs and cats, and everything that is nasty was seen when the soiled herbs were swept up and exchanged for fresh ones. But you know what doesn't help a castle? The smell of rotting corpses. Ah, luxury. There are heads of enemies cooking in the sun on spikes right outside your fresh air slit. There's the remains of a peasant shredded by mad dogs in the courtyard below, and someone is literally rotting just to your left in the wall. Castles were riddled with the dead. In the case of an oubliette, they were quite literally riddled. An oubliette is basically a little coffin cave thing dug into a wall, where a particularly hated prisoner could be tossed in, bricked up, and completely forgotten about. Fittingly, oubliette comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. Given some of the other medieval death options, I guess starving to death bricked into a rat-infested hole wasn't the worst way to go. It's still was way creepier to think that on any given day a castle had people rotting in its figurative basements and walls. Must have been for great ghost stories though, not great for the smell of their decomposing body quite literally wafting up through the floorboards later. Next up is how horrible it would have been to be a lady on the rack. So, ladies have periods and they need some way to handle the menses mess without the feminine hygiene products we have today. This ain't the Victorian era where it was commonplace to weirdly free bleed everywhere. Medieval women preferred one of two choices. She could always catch the flow after it left her body, or find a way to absorb it internally. In our modern words, medieval women could use a makeshift pad or a makeshift tampon. Pads were made of a scrap fabric or rag, thus the whole on the rag thing. Cotton was preferred because the material absorbs fluid better than the alternative wood, which not only repels liquid, but it's itchy and uncomfortable. Whether they made the choice of a homemade pad or homemade tampon, medieval women worried about leaks and stains. This is the main reason why red was a popular medieval petticoat color. The scarlet color was not only fashionable and decorative, but functional to disguise leaks. Now, the period ain't what's gross, it never is. It's what wealthy castle-dwelling women could afford to block said period that was gross. A common type of bog moss found throughout medieval England, Sophagon cimifibolian, was a remarkably absorbent material. Ladies stuffed their homemade pads and tampons with it, and folks even used it as toilet paper or as battlefield dressing. The popular name for this moss is blood moss. Entomologists contend that this moniker comes from its use in battlefield first aid. This account, of course, oozes heroism and masculinity. In reality, it earned the name from being used in menses and shoved up there. And definitely, my favorite on the list today is protection wasn't just armor. One of the most interesting castle finds includes the protection discovered in Dudley Castle in 1885. Dating from the early 1600s, they're the earliest definitive physical evidence of the use of animal membrane jimmy hats in post-medieval Europe. The intact deposits uncovered during excavations contained both domestic and organic remains of the occupying royalists who defended the castle under siege between 1642 and 1646. The keep's latrines had been sealed during the demolition of the castle's defenses in 1647. Examining further, scientists were able to determine that 5 blackened jimmy hats had been used, and a further 5 non-blackened ones were presumably unused, all folded in on one another. The Department of Scientific Research at the British Museum boasts that their significance was magnified due to the nature of the find and the extraordinary archaeological circumstances in which they were found. Who might have used them is unknown. However, the complexity of the manufacture must have made them relatively expensive, so perhaps the preserve of an officer class. It's known that officers' wives were present during the royalist occupation. However, this discovery definitely testifies this was neither the time nor place to pop out a kid. Stay safe and use protection, y'all.
Number 10. Famine. This was not modern times and nowhere close to the industrial agriculture industries we have today. Most folks lived in small towns that were self-sufficient with their farms and animals. After paying up or giving up what they had to their lords, of course, the commoners were not left with much. Men were expected to work all day to provide for his lord, family, and himself. Trouble is, if something even slightly disrupts the farming process, and trust me, there's a lot of factors that would lead to that, then some people are gonna go hungry. When people get hungry, they do crazy things. I was crazy once. They locked me in a room full of rubber. Rubber makes me crazy. I was crazy once. They locked me in a room full of rubber. Rubber makes me crazy. Number 9. War. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. You guys love that song, I know you do. Picture this. You're a serf working day and night to feed your family. When a town crier brings news to you that your village is gonna be under attack and the invaders have been seen coming over the hill, just over yonder, it's somewhere over there. It's over there. The king is sending his best knights to defend the castle, but you know, like many other folks in many other towns, that to protect your family and your stuff, your pitchfork is gonna need a sharpening. And maybe a fire buff. I like fire buffs, they're cool. Yes, war, the worst invention of mankind, when you think about it. War means you need soldiers, and that means men. Except for a few exceptions like Joan of Arc. You can throw them in too. Sadly for the peasants, it's a matter of protecting what's theirs. There's no glory in fighting for someone else's glory if it means your farm gets burned down in an attack. And then you can't eat, and then no one's hungry, and no good. Number 8. Pestilence. In case you didn't know, you probably do, but sickness was an issue for the folks in medieval times, especially if you're a man who's working in the fields or the markets or the public, trying to bring home whatever form of currency is appropriate for the area. You can't do anything if you're sick in bed, or at least that's what I used to tell my mom when I wasn't totally faking a stomachache because I didn't want to go to school. I totally wasn't faking it, I was sick. But a big bug going around at the time in people's tummies was the bubonic plague. Yeah, classic. The big one. Some statistics suggest staggering numbers of people succumbing to the plague. Millions of people, and the plague isn't a pretty one. Skin turning black from necrosis, boils, blisters, ugh, it's a bad look. You don't want it. Number 7, serfdom. While not exactly like YouTube's least favorite S word, it's kinda similar, and it sucks. Basically, you're in the lowest of the low in terms of peasantry. You are forced to farm and tend the land that the Lord owns. There's nothing like breaking your back for a guy who doesn't know that you're breaking your back for him. I'm curious, guys, let me know what's been your worst job and why. I'm gonna read some comments again in a later video. But yeah, being a serf sucked. Imagine after all that awfulness that you have to pay your boss rent too because you also live on the property that you work. Yeah, not so fun, pretty messed up. I'm glad we don't do that anymore. Number 6, jester. Imagine trying to write funny and comical things day in and day out until your fingers cramp, and you have to perform your material in front of a bloodthirsty crowd who's just itching to say something the second you make a mistake. Or if you upset the king, it could cost you your head. What a crazy job, right? I know. However, one jester had it all figured out. The one thing that binds us all together as humans, the type of comedy no scholar or peasant alike can escape. Farting. Yes. Take Roland the Farter for instance, whose job was to fart. Every Christmas he would show up to the king's place and just let her rip. Boy, do I wish that was my job. Cause honey, let me tell you something. I got some special stuff up on my arse.
So they colonized half the world for spices, but aren't the best at using them. It's sugar and spice and not so nice sauce. Spices were stupid expensive because Western Europe isn't exactly known for fiery flora or flavorful plants. And the only real means of transportation tended to die if you rode them too far, horses. So obviously you're just getting rare bits of dried herb brought back from crusades that you also have no idea what it is or how to use, and that's only if you're wealthy too. A lot of recipes described the peasants and even the wealthy seasonings as vinegar, ginger, garlic, chopped bread, unripe apples, and almond milks. AKA, most people were limited to flavoring their foods with whatever BS they had lying around, mostly the tart or sour, leading to the modern British tradition of refusing to eat food that actually tastes like anything. Like spices, sugar was so expensive that it blackened rotten teeth became a status symbol. It was so coveted that when it finally became cheaper and more accessible to the average person in the 16th century, people went nuts. They were rolling meat in it, vegetables, and probably themselves. People tried to liven up their bland-ass food with sauces, but the limited access to dairy and tomatoes were still a twinkle in the eyes of the colonizers. And these sauces, they weren't the sort of thing you'd want to dip your pizza rolls in as a result. At the beginning of the medieval period, sauces were based on milk, or wine, or butter, or simply the au jus, which emerged as part of the cooking process. Because bread was so important to the overall caloric intake and to maintaining the consistent mold and food poisoning that was killing them all, flour could not be wasted to prepare sauces and gravies, except on the tables of the rich. Their sauces were more like oatmeal, which you'd only serve on vegetables today if you want to ruin them. To give you an idea, one sauce is gruel, it's pounded oatmeal mixed with broth. Oh man, what a treat. Next up is beaver tails, but not the bannock type. Usually saying beaver tail, you think of that sweet, fluffy fried dough covered in sugar, maybe ice cream that's found at carnivals or amusement parks, or that hometown restaurant that sells them for $6.50 even though they're the size of your head. But medieval beaver tail? Whole different animal. Wait, well, whatever. Anyways, as discussed, medieval peasants were fasting like 3/4 of the year. That's a long time. So the church compromised by simply forbidding people to eat meat during fasting holidays, and then compromised further by agreeing fish isn't meat. But why stop there? People went even further by deciding certain parts of animals found in water that kind of looked like a fish, like a beaver's tail, counted as fish. Beaver tails were similar in shape to flatfish if you used your imagination. They looked like they were covered in scales and they spent a lot of time underwater, therefore they're actually fish. And they provided a cheap stand-in for the country's fishless poorer masses. But again, why stop there? The 17th century was no longer just the tail that was allowed on fast days, but the whole beaver itself. The beaver was a fish due to the fact it was an excellent swimmer. Unsurprisingly, the 17th century is the same year the beaver goes extinct, tanked thanks to overconsumption. Now the beaver is thriving once more again in England, Wales, and Scotland thanks to successful reintroduction programs from Canada, because we stay carrying that team. A medieval peasant walks into a bar and orders a drink and has to correct the bartender because they ordered a cock ale, not a cocktail. This hilariously named beer was made by tossing a boiled and crushed dead cockerel with 4 pounds of raisins, nutmeg, mace, and a ½ pound of dates inside a canvas bag. The bag was then placed in ale and left there to steep for 6 or 7 days. It was then bottled and kept still for a month, after which, ready for consumption. This was the most popular recipe as shared in a 1669 news article by Calnan Digby. Why was this done to beer when it was already medieval times and it tasted bad enough? Well, it wasn't to produce dead chicken flavored beer, which is why strong herbs were there to overpower the chicken. The reason for ruining perfectly good beer with a giant chicken tea bag stemmed from the belief that the beer would be imparted with the cockerel's characteristics of strength, vigor, and courage. It was therefore mainly drunk by big manly men who wanted to be even bigger and even more manly. It was described as a pleasant drink, said to be provocative, aka it excited lust and aroused the body. In 19th century dictionary slang, cock ale was directly identified as a homely aphrodisiac. However, it naturally fell out of favor eventually for beer that didn't taste like dead chickens. I'm super angry about this one, but apparently it was only done in times of serious famine. It's roast cat. Cats were considered highly useful in keeping pests and vermin away. Dogs weren't so much of a commonplace thing, and usually they were the first to be eaten pet-wise when it came to serious food shortages. However, if the going gets tough, you have the option of hunting down some ferals in the woods to feed the fam. So, ever wonder how to roast a cat? According to one medieval recipe, you start off by cutting off the head and tossing it away, because it is not for eating. For they say that eating the brains will cause him who eats them to lose his senses and judgment. Then you do the cleaning. At this stage, the feline may look ready to roast, but alas, you must first bury it in the ground for a day and a night before you do. Then you unbury it, spit it, roast it, and whip it with a green stick. You can serve the roasted cat by soaking it in broth and garlic. To quote the end of the recipe, and you may eat it because it is very good food, which I feel like they threw in because they knew folks were not sold on eating dead ground food. And of course, what better to end this list than literal garbage, a real, literal actual name for a medieval dish. The historical food blogs are fighting for their lives to try and say this recipe is super tasty, and they've used the old recipe to make it at home. I do not believe you. I will die on this hill. This is probably the worst titled dish in history, and its ingredient list does not improve it. I have found 4 recipes, and each is just worse than the rest, all going as far back as 1393. So, most generically, you're gonna need all the worst parts of a chicken. You need the head, the livers, the gizzards. Throw them into a nice pot. Add fresh beef broth, powdered pepper, cinnamon, cloves, mace, parsley, sage, all chopped small. Then take bread, like actual bread. Just take a whole loaf and just put that in the pot. Boil it, then put it through a strainer, then boil it again. Add powdered ginger, verjuice, which is unripe apple juice, salt, and a little saffron. Then serve it forth. To have it English style means leaving the pieces of animal and chunks in there when you serve it. Having it French style is to strain it once more and serve it just as a thin broth. Imagine making it brothy soup style, serving that to your buddies before telling them afterwards what they ate.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the Leech Collector. This job truly is exactly what it sounds like. It's a person who is responsible for the collection of leeches. The little bloodsuckers were a popular treatment back in medieval times when just bleeding was a common treatment for a variety of ailments. Headache? Just bleed a bit. Common cold? Have I got a solution for you? Bloodletting, especially by way of leech, was actually used medicinally for thousands of years with possible ties to ancient Egypt. This medical treatment, however, of course, required leeches, which meant that someone needed to collect them. Many leech collectors were people who didn't have a lot of money, and more commonly, women. The job required wading in the water and searching for leeches, and how do you catch them? With your legs, of course. Leech collectors would wait for leeches to latch onto them, and normally would have to wait for about 20 minutes before pulling them off because they were easier to remove after getting fat with blood. How horrible. This already sounds awful, but what's worse is that after being bitten by a leech, the wounds tend to bleed more than a normal cut even would. This was great to get more leeches interested, but bad as a human who is trying to keep blood inside of their body. This job usually led to those who did it to contract illnesses from the leeches, their open wounds, or just have severe blood loss because at the time, people didn't know you could overdo it with bloodletting this way. In our number 9 spot today, we have the fuller. Wool is a clothing staple. It's been used for centuries, but back in medieval times there was a disgusting part of the job that thankfully doesn't exist anymore thanks to the invention of modern chemistry. Wool is naturally waterproof due to the fact that it contains oils that have been distributed from the sheep's skin, and these oils are what made the entire harvesting, carding, spinning, and weaving processes possible in these times. This is all fine and well, but the trouble comes in after all of that, because the cloth at the end of it all was coarse and easily frayed, and this is where the job of a fuller came in. They were tasked with removing the oil from the cloth. Okay, a little alkaline solution, no problem, right? Well, yeah. Except for in these times, the most accessible and cheap alkaline solution was stale urine. Yep, just a bunch of old pee. A fuller had to take this new woven material, put it into a tub full of old pee from who knows where, and then you stomp on it with your feet. And then you get no shower at the end of it either. What's a carpenter without his tool belt, right? What I mean is that fullers were also responsible for collecting their own pee to use for the wool, so they often needed to head to all the local public toilets and private homes to collect it. Just gets worse. In our number 8 spot today we have the groom of the stool. This job doesn't sound too bad with just the title. It weirdly sounds kind of regal. I mean, it was quite a prestigious position during this time, but it also was one of the most humiliating jobs in history. In the medieval times, kings were looked on almost as if they were gods. You know, it's their divine right. And because of this divine right, for centuries it was deemed improper for a king to wipe his own behind after using the facilities. This is where the groom of the stool comes in. This high-level nobleman would be responsible for fetching the toilet chair for the king when nature called, and he would also be in charge of the wiping aspect of the whole thing. No bidets, I guess, back then. The groom of the stool also played a role in monitoring the king's health, as he was tasked with examining the stool just to watch for any serious changes. And should the king be having some digestive troubles at any point, the groom of the stool would always be nearby and ready to administer a royal enema. In our number 7 spot today we have the nightman. This is definitely one of the shittiest jobs from the medieval times, and I mean that quite literally. Also referred to as gong farmers, these people had the unfortunate job of cleaning out all of the human waste from the cesspits in the castle walls, which they would then transport to a pre-arranged location where it would be buried. These cesspits were the medieval equivalent to a septic tank, and they were usually located on the lowest level of the castle. The nightmen would end up digging through weeks, months, just sometimes even years of disgustingness, and they were motivated to gather as much as possible considering the fact that they were paid by the ton. Imagine, that's a frightening amount of work. The job was also quite hazardous, too. I mean, if we really think about what exactly they were doing, it quickly becomes clear that many of them died from disease, and there was also a good chunk of people who suffocated on the job as well. In our number 6 spot today we have a sin eater. Okay, this is definitely one of the strangest jobs on this list. The job of a sin eater was to, well, eat sins. To do this, they were tasked with eating a piece of bread that had been placed on the chest of someone who had died. Definitely not an ideal day of work for me personally. The idea behind this was that in consuming the bread, they were consuming the sins of that person so that they could carry on into the afterlife peacefully. Basically, sin eaters were willing to sacrifice their own souls and their own eternal happiness just to make some money while they were alive. I'm not sure what's worse, taking the risk with the sins or eating bread from off of a dead person. No, both bad.
Number 5. Joan of Arc. Finally, a woman in the Middle Ages. Who'da thunk? Joan of Arc was considered and still is revered the heroine of France for her role in the Siege of Orleans during France's 100-year war with England. Joan of Arc, a peasant with faith on her side, had believed that God had chosen her to lead France in victory against England and had spoken to her since she was young. At only age 17, she had stolen men's armors, a white horse, and like a Valkyrie riding into battle, she had convinced an entire army that she was appointed by God to win. And then did! That's the most badass thing I've ever heard in my entire life. After such a miraculous victory, her reputation spread among France, and upon her capture and death at 19, the Maid of Orleans herself would forever live on as one of the greatest saints and symbols of the country of France. Number 4. Henry V. Another war? All these people do is kill each other. Does anyone fish? Or golf? No one, huh? Just swords and heads, swords and heads. A history itself. This time, England beats France. King Henry V, Prince Hal himself, leans into his kingly duties, demolishing France in what Shakespeare would delve into years to come. The Battle of Agincourt is one of England's most celebrated victories and was one of the most important triumphs in the 100 Years' War. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. Henry V, prologue. Good stuff. How come these guys didn't just like rap battle or play soccer or something? Like, an arrow right through the chest is way worse than a red card, just saying. Hey, speaking of soccer. Number 3, mob football. I'm not talking about the mafia. Put 1,000 on Brady, would you? I'm talking about mob football, also known as folk football. It's just like our modern day soccer. Town versus town. Except it has an unlimited amount of players. And there's only 2 rules to the game. Get the inflated pig's bladder over the opposing team's lines on the other side of town, and no murdering. I mean, I guess this is closer to rugby? Yeah, this is literally just rugby. This game was played competitively and eventually outlawed at Oxford University in 1555. Just a guy named Jeeves in a polo. Oh yeah, I play mob football at Oxford. Yeah, I'm also in a frat. This game got so out of hand it was banned numerous times in England. There is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls from which many evils may arise which God forbid. We command and forbid on behalf of the king, on pain of imprisonment, such game to be used in the city of the future. Thankfully this game has calmed down over the years and now has become the most popular played and watched game across the world. Go Liverpool! Number 2, the printing press. The printing press is a machine that was designed for the mass printing of text, mostly in form of books and newspapers. With an unknown date of origin, first invented in China, this machine designed in the 15th century by Johannes Gutenberg was a revolutionary new form of writing which would only change the direction of history with the mass production of uniform text. Long story short, people didn't have to get the world's worst wrist cramp writing Hamlet over and over again. To be, or not to be, 86 more folios? The alphabetical metal keys would be placed into the device and slammed into the paper, pressing ink upon the parchment. You know there's gotta be some books half written in purple ink because they just ran out of black. Come on, we've all been there. Ink's expensive. Number 1, William Shakespeare. The Bard himself, arguably the most influential writer of the English language. William Shakespeare was born in Stratford, England. One of the easiest ways we can look back into the dialogue and lifestyle used by the people living in the Middle Ages. This playwright documents the world in which he lives from 1564 to 1616. Due to Shakespeare's unbelievable talent for building and fabricating an array of diverse stories and characters via players, modern day is able to see the Middle Ages and the similarities and differences the people were experiencing. His plays are based in the environment that they were written in. He writes about diseases, he writes about monarchy, he writes about women's rights. Okay, so no one actually got turned into a donkey by some fairies in the woods, but some of those wars actually did happen, and some of those kings and queens were really twisted. How this man created so many brilliant works and stories, all part of the mystery. What do you think? Genius? Or did the guy have some help? One man in his time plays many parts.
With scalps so oily they could star in grease, it's no wonder lice was everywhere. You know what? I will give them a little bit more credit. It is true, after a certain point of not using shampoo, even the straightest of thin hair can regulate its oil levels. So their scalps probably weren't the worst, but maybe they were rocking some hella dandruff. Also, as I mentioned, lice. Say you're somehow living a medieval life healthily, being whatever you are in the castle. You're making a living, you're not sick, and nobody wants to tie you to a chair and dunk you underwater. Even if you've managed that, you still have lice. Bugs were everywhere, man, all kinds of them. On you, in your room, in your food, nowhere was safe. Lice was such a way of life that people treated appointments to get deloused in pretty much the same way people treat appointments for a haircut today. Maybe an exaggeration, but you get what I mean. People in the Middle Ages and medieval times took lice to their grave, living a life of itch, 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 itch. No one likes having rats and mice in their house. Unfortunately for castle dwellers, the dark, cold living quarters within the castle afforded the perfect breeding ground and lifestyle for plenty of rodents and bugs, carrying diseases that could have meant the end for any of the castle's residents. Name something grosser than a non-ventilated stone behemoth full of unwashed bodies. So why no washy-washy of the body? Why is that so difficult to accomplish? Jump in a river or something, right? Wrong. Leeches, disease, death. Also, hot baths are preferred. Regular and incredibly convenient bathing as we know it today did not exist in Europe until the late 19th century, so Europeans in the 13th, 14th, and 1500s were not vibing with that idea. Firstly, water was precious, especially during sieges, and the work was so hard and manual and labor intensive that you would build up a sweat the moment you got out of the bathtub, so bathing was seen as a waste of time. I mean, wash off 2 weeks worth of grime and one little batch of sweat made that a waste. Your bathwater's probably brown, dude, still seems kinda worth it. But secondly, the trouble of setting up a bath just didn't seem to be worth it. No running water water, so if you wanted a hot bath, you had to boil the water yourself over a fire, carry hot water buckets upstairs to the bathtub, fill the bathtub and not spill the hot water on yourself, get the temperature right, put the soap in if you had any, get in, wash before it cooled, get out, dry, put your clothes back on, and then you have to bail out the entire bathtub by hand with a bucket and find a window to toss the water out of onto some unsuspecting servant. So yeah, it was a lot of work. And what of feces? What do these highly civilized, highly sanitary individuals have to offer us for the call of nature? The modern toilet didn't exist back in the 14th century. Instead, you either had a closed stool, which was a special seat with a bucket underneath, or you used a privy, which is a seat with a hole in it. So why not call them the same thing? Whatever, medieval people. Waste going through the closed stool, which by the way is where we get the feces nickname stool, was collected in the bucket, which was then removed, emptied, washed, and replaced. Waste that passed through the seat of a privy, which was the early kind of toilet, ended up in one of two places. If the castle had a moat around it, the waste probably would have gone in there. If it didn't have a moat, or if the privy was located somewhere without access to water, bodily waste ended up in a cesspit at the very bottom of the castle. But anyways, check out what some of the privies looked like. From what I gathered reading, there really were some castles without designated rooms for these. Just could find them in random hallways in case you want to whip it out and take a leak right there. At Perivale Castle, you often find privies high up in the wall, high above the smell and safe from attackers who might use the literal crap hole to get into the castle like a reverse Shawshank escape. The most famous example of this allegedly took place during the siege of Chateau Galliard in 1204. Talk about a crappy job, it's the royal bleep shoveler. You know the word, it rhymes. So, cesspit, the medieval crap dungeon thing. Though medieval people didn't know about germs, they believed bad smells caused illnesses, meaning when the stank started wafting up a little too hard, one unfortunate man would have to clean it out. Like rich people nowadays scheduling a maid, whenever this dude showed up, everyone in the castle would hightail it out so as to not have to interact. The gong farmer would shovel the poop into baskets and wheelbarrows and take it off to bury or spread on fields as fertilizer for the food they ate. Gong farming could be dangerous. In 1325, Richard the Raker fell into a cesspit and drowned. Say goodbye to sinus and sense of smell as the acids cook that out of you, and stay away from the infectious bacteria literally everywhere. However, gong farmers were quite well paid despite people not wanting to ever get close to them due to their smell. Rest assured though, because castle logic was that closets and toilets are one of the same. The private castle privy was always sharing the same space as the residents stowed away personal belongings in a room called garderobes. Obviously, you can see this as a stepping stone to a wardrobe being a sequestered small offshoot room. Inside the garderobe was also a toilet hole next to your Sunday best. Logic dictated clothes should be kept close to the toilet to prevent insects from damaging them.
At number 5, always in danger. When knights weren't out in some kind of battlefield, they didn't just get to sit around doing nothing waiting for the next battle. They were still knights and people loved them, so they had to entertain people through tournaments. This wasn't your average tournament like when you went to medieval times as a kid, because this was way bloodier and safety was not really much of a priority. It wasn't as dangerous as going off to battle, but there was still a risk that knights had to take, and sometimes it ended fatally. Tournaments would normally involve two different events, melee and jousting. We all know what jousting is though, right? It's where two knights on horseback charge at each other with lances, trying to knock their opponent off their horse. This sport injured and even killed people in the past. In 1559, the King of France, Henry II, was killed during a jousting tournament because his opponent's lance broke apart and sent splinters into his eyes and brain. These tournaments were meant for fun and games and entertainment, but they often ended in bloodshed in some way, so these knights always had to risk their lives even when they weren't in an active fight. At number 4, fired. As with any kind of job, medieval knights could get fired. These days, if you get fired, you just have to find another job to fall back on, but for knights, they had it much worse. Knights served their kings, and so if they did anything that went against their monarch, or if they did something that the king didn't like, they could essentially be fired from being a knight, since the king is the one who made them one in the first place. What the king giveth, he could taketh away, pretty much. When a knight was fired, the king would start by hacking off the knight's spurs, then they would break their sword, then they would burn the knight's coat of arms, and hang their shield upside down for the entire kingdom to see, because these people really liked public humiliation. And if you thought that was enough, just you wait, because on top of the spurs and the sword and the shield, they would also execute the knight for good measure, so really, you never ever want to get fired back then, because it would really end badly for for you. At number 3, burial. For medieval knights, dying was just part of the job. When someone became a knight, they knew that this was a risk that they were going to have to take. And for some knights, they worried about where they would be buried because it had to be in the right spot, otherwise they wouldn't go to heaven. When a knight died in battle, their body had to be buried in the right kind of dirt, and that was the consecrated dirt of a church graveyard. To solve this problem for young knights, when they were knighted, they would also be given a burial plot in a church graveyard, so they knew that they were guaranteed a spot in heaven when they died. This, however, created a bit of a loophole for anyone wanting to get a one-way ticket to heaven, because even older knights who enlisted later in life would be able to get buried beneath a stone effigy in a church and be able to go to heaven even if they really never did all that churchy stuff beforehand. At number 2, yummy people. As you could probably imagine, for medieval knights, desperate times called for desperate measures. Oftentimes during battles, supplies would run out and knights would be left dealing with starvation on top of everything else that they were going through. This proved to be a huge problem during the Crusades, because after supplies and food started to run out, people got desperate and started seeing other people as snacks, if you know what I mean. Some of the poorest crusaders resorted to eating people to get them through their journey to take back the Holy Lands, and as you can imagine, it was a pretty gory sight to see. Knights back then recalled seeing enemy forces on spits and dismembered people just laying around in plain view. It was rough being a knight back then, and the amount of shortcuts and strategies people came up with just to survive got real dark real fast. And finally, at number 1, dehydration. On top of not having enough to eat, many knights from the Crusades also didn't have anything to drink, and many of them died of dehydration. Dehydration was especially deadly during heat waves. At one point, things got so bad for knights embarking on their holy war that 500 knights died of dehydration in just one summer back in 1097. Since it was such a terrible way to go, people started weaponizing dehydration, so to speak. This happened when the Sultan Saladin lured the enemy forces away from their water source and set fire to the grass around the enemy troops, causing them to overheat. Because they couldn't drink anything and because of the intense heat, the troops got too weak to fight back, and then they were defeated by Saladin. The elements were so intense that these knights really had it bad. Weaponizing dehydration, that is a super messed up thing to do, but back then, people were ruthless.
Such as the forbidden omelet. It's not really an omelet actually, it's more like if you cut a pancake-like slab out of the color canary yellow. Back in medieval times, Lent and the other billion days they spent fasting were a miserable affair where Christians ate like lentils and dried fish every day for a month. The English came up with a solution for this tiresome diet, the tansy, a sweet and savory dish that was somewhere between a pancake and a vegan omelet. Tansies took their name from the Tantatum vulgare herb that grew across the country at that time in great abundance. Eventually a lot more ingredients were added to tansies, such as parsley, feverfew, almonds, breadcrumbs, nutmeg, cream, and butter. Ironically, despite the love of tansies and the fact this plant was used to treat medical ailments, it was later discovered to be poisonous. Dangerous to consume, rub on skin, the whole 9 yards of poison. Hilariously, that did not stop the English from quite literally driving it to extinction. No more tansies now. And what could possibly be more tasty than something that you can make laxatives out of, perfume, and car oil? It's whale vomit. Ambergris is often considered as one of the world's strangest natural occurrences, and it's been used as an ingredient in food and drink alone for hundreds of years. Europeans used ambergris as medication for headaches, colds, epilepsy, and other ailments. The first reported use of ambergris in perfumery comes from Muslim Spain. It has been used for flavoring everything from cigarettes to Turkish coffee and even hot chocolate. If you like the TV show Bob's Burgers, you may know it from their episode titled as such, where the kids find a big old chunk of it washed up ashore in their wharf town. Something that does still happen nowadays, so keep your eye out for what looks like a giant chunk of earwax at the beach. Formed in the intestinal tracts of sperm whales over decades, ambergris is a grayish-brown waxy substance that some scientists believe is produced by whales to help ease the passage of objects they have eaten that they can't digest before expelling the same way whales expel fecal waste. Usually found floating in the sea or washed up on beaches, ambergris has not only been the foodstuff of choice for royalty, but it's also been a firm favorite of the perfume industry even today, thanks to its strong and lingering scent. Nowadays, ambergris has fallen out of favor as a food additive, possibly because people found out what it does and where it came from, but it's still used in the perfume industry apart from in countries where it's banned, such as Australia and the United States. Another absolutely bizarre natural occurrence they enjoyed was the open arse. The rudest entry on this list by a country mile. Open arses were actually a common commonly consumed variety of apple in medieval ages, and they do not look appetizing. What is that? It looks like a Photoshop project of a potato, persimmon, and a crab apple put together. I would say don't judge a book by its cover, but the inside is an effing mess too. Look at that. Who thought that was edible? Who said, look, that looks tasty, give me a bite? It literally has the composition of a moldy peach. According to the interwebs, the apple got its rather vulgar nickname from its appearance of the underside. The calces, which normally look like this on an apple, are very large, and they're spread apart on an open arse, giving the underside of an apple a distinctly certain exit human appearance. Somehow, looking like that and being still called an open arse, the apple managed to pick up popularity in the 13th century and remain popular for cooking well into the 17th. Dying of fever or just in the mood for an inconvenient, hard-to-cook dish? Well, you may want to consider roast rodent. Those little roly-polies, hedgehogs were considered a cure for everything from sore throat to leprosy. Their fat and intestines were considered the most viable. Hedgehogs may seem like an unlikely source of nourishment for us today, not just because of their prickly spines, yet their quills didn't deter determined chefs of the past globally, especially in medieval times when they prepared roasted hedgehogs by gutting and trussing them just like pullets. The hedgehogs were then roasted, and then only after they were pressed in a towel to dry and served with camelline sauce or wrapped in pastry and then broiled again. A piece of advice: if you're trying to roast a hedgehog and it refuses to unroll, simply take the dead body and put it in hot water. Or at least that's what the recipe books say. It's gross now, it was gross then, but hell do we love it. It's fast food. Stopping for a few minutes to pick up a meat pie for lunch was as common as hitting the drive-thru today, and just as likely to give you diarrhea. Just back then, diarrhea would probably kill you. Fast food cooks were notorious for using diseased or undercooked meat, or just warming up yesterday's spoiled leftovers. Again, not very different from what goes on at back at Taco Hell, or Taco Bell. Fast foods of London of the late 13th and early 14th century contained easy, portable foods much like today's Big Mac. Meat pies, hotcakes, tansies, and wafers. These meat pies, called umble pies, consisted of edible entrails from deer or wild animals, generally just scrap meat. These cook shops functioned like medieval drive-thrus where customers walked up and put an order at the window. The food was being mass prepared, then individually produced. They toss your little pie in the flames right there, pull her out a second later, and there you go, enjoy your entrails and wheat. In many urban areas, one street became known as the fast food capital for the city. In Bristol, Cook's Row catered to the customers looking for fast, tasty food. As a result of these innovative fast food kitchens, professional cooks emerged during the medieval period, employed at the great estates and in smaller shops of urban centers. On a lighter note, pigs in your blanket. No, not in yours. Because when you live in a mud and straw hut that is 100% full of humidity and would absorb every smell ever brought into it, including that of the family beer bucket, what you want to do is add an animal pen to that and a loosely made roaring fire in the middle of the room. There were a number of home designs revolving around a single room first floor with a fence or other partial barrier dividing it. Animals were kept on one side of the barrier, humans lived on the other. This kept the animals' body heat inside the house, marginally adding to the indoor temperatures during the cold season and providing literal hell during the summer ones. But I mean, hey, you could always let them wander loosely outside. But weren't medieval houses like super tiny? Correct, but so were the medieval farm animals. Homies were undernourished and so small that a full-grown bull was around the size of a modern calf, and sheep were only a third of the size that they are now today. Modern sheep yield around 7.3 pounds of wool. Medieval fleece yield was something less than 1 pound per animal. And speaking of, let's segue into how all your food was dry. We can't truly know if medieval food was bad because nowadays we're spoiled. We have spice and garlic and proper cooking abilities. They had some meat, some grains, some vegetables, and a figured the F out mentality. As a result, we're gonna be more grossed out or picky with their food, but if we experienced it from their perspective without having tasted the food we've tasted now, it probably wouldn't be half bad. But hell would it be dry. Just so dry. That's the one thing I don't think any of us could survive, even with perspective. In the medieval period, meats and breads were kept well stored by drying them. Meat specifically was salted then dried. Bread at the time wasn't made with yeast, so it tended to be flatter and it didn't mold. It would just go harder with time. time. Let's do some comparison. Here's the meat of the medieval period compared with some modern day beef jerky, the closest thing. Even our dried meat of the 21st century is juicier than the medieval version and probably wouldn't be the usual jaw workout. Now for bread, here's some medieval bread and here's some modern day bread of similar composition. See how medieval bread is a lot more enclosed and sturdier than modern bread? Looks like if you needed a spare tire, you could drill a hole in this bad boy, toss her on the frame. Medieval food was meant to last. And sometimes making things like these breads and meats were the family business. You may have seen the recent 10 reasons why living in ancient Egypt was impossible video, in which case you'd know that it was a custom of the times and place for a father to determine the career of his son. This ideology was shared in a few other places, ancient China, Greece, and medieval England apparently, where the trades were usually passed from generation to generation. Commoners in the Middle Ages worked where they lived. Consequently, it made it easier for their trade to be passed down from father through son through exposure from a young age. It also meant that the father of the household suddenly died or was called to battle. A son, no matter his age, could immediately pick up on his father's role and provide for the household, and thus it remained the family business. If your dad was a cobbler, you would most likely be a cobbler. Unlike the Egyptians, whose sons would branch out and try new trades as they got older and sometimes establish their family in another commerce, the medieval English really stayed stuck in their ways, to the point that when they finally did adopt last names, they were usually that of their profession, which is why you'll see a lot of brewers, smiths, archer, fisher, potters, and so forth. But before 1066, you survived off of only one name, which doesn't seem that bad, but it definitely was. Let's explain why. Problem 1, if you're in a room with like 3 Williams, you can't just yell a last name to find the specific William you need. Problem 2, let's say one of these Williams kills someone in the room and the dying man says William killed him, but there's no way for him to tell you which one it was. Now all the Williams in town get rounded up. Problem 3, there's no cameras, and the eyewitnesses can verify 3 of the Williams in town as being in the room, but nobody can determine which one killed the man since they're all 5'4" white dudes with brown hair. How do we resolve this problem? Depends on the village, the clergy, and how much those Williams were each liked in town if anybody had a bias towards them. They may determine the right one. They may decide to hang all of them because they don't know who did it. When surnames were introduced, they'd often include a nickname, such as Richard Red if your hair was red. If Richard went bald over time, he could change it to Richard Bald. And now our last reason you couldn't survive is just by being Cornish. If you were Cornish, you weren't regarded as English. When the Truro received its crown charter in 1173, it addressed it to the barons of Cornwall and all men, both Cornish and English. Let's break into why that is in a little known history lesson. Cornish is straightforward, Celtic people native to the island of Britain. English is more complicated, derived from a Scottish pronunciation of the word Angles. The Scots, and eventually all of the Celts, had adopted this word to refer to the Angles and the Saxons who'd been invading their lands and who would soon form together to declare themselves the kings, forcing control over the Cornish people. The Cornish were made to do hard labor in mines, their language made illegal, and they were taxed to death to fund the other English colonial wars and pursuits, originally with the other Celts and then in the Americas, Africa, and India. Funding these colonial wars meant that the English stripped the land, so they clear-cut every tree and ran every mine dry, killing millions of Cornish people in the process. The Cornish rose up against the English tyrants many times, and on several occasions would have overthrown London itself if it had not been for terrible betrayals from supposed allies. Eventually, there was not enough wealth in Cornwall to sustain the Cornish. Millennia of Roman wars and occupation followed by English wars and occupation had destroyed the land and broken the people. This is what drove the Cornish dysphoria, and it's why there's now 10 times as many English in Cornwall than there are actual Cornish people. Elders there still suffer the effects of intergenerational trauma and PTSD.
Number 10. The kitchen. Now that you've got your appetite, let's talk about the kitchen. Major kitchens of the castle usually had to deal with providing at least 2 meals for several hundred people every day. As you can imagine, this is where the work would be put in. By a large staff too, usually in the hundreds. So you're sweaty from working and surrounded by a bunch of other blokes. Sounds pretty awful. But you didn't take into account the amount of heat. The guidelines on how to make enough food for a 2-day banquet include the chief cook having to at least have 1,000 cartloads of good dry firewood and a large barn full of coal to keep the fires going. It's spicy in the kitchen, let me tell you. Number 9. The main hall. The idea of a standing army wasn't exactly a thing during the medieval period, so what you would have is your knights or castle soldiers. And unless there was a barracks, the main hall would often convert to have a bunch of cots in it where these soldiers would sleep. It could also be where your guests might stay, and even your servants if you didn't have a room for either of them. And then it became your dining room. It was also your party room. And your courtroom. It was honestly a pretty versatile room. So much room for activity. You could probably imagine the amount of tomfoolery that happened here though. A large group of sweaty men and women after a feast, and they don't have to walk home because they are staying the night. Nice. Number 8, the pooper. The title says unholy, but this room's main purpose is to have a hole. A hole for people to sit their little keisters down on and drop the kids off. Sometimes down a nice long shaft through the castle that went straight to the cesspit or to the moat. If the moat was a room, I'd probably include it on this list because, yikes. A toilet isn't something you'd actually find in most medieval castles. There are easier places to do your business outside. The garderobe is basically a tiny little closet-sized room with a hole in it for this sole purpose. But they were also used for storage, like when you had visitors. You gotta put their coats and cloaks somewhere. Why not next to where Steve is trying to go potty? Number 7, dovecotes. You know when you walk down the street and a white colored excrement falls on you from above and you look up to see a pigeon just looking down on you as if it owns your whole existence? Imagine that, times like 2,500 in a circular tower, and you've got a dovecote. These structures actually showed off status and wealth as only the lords were legally allowed to have them. Doves and pigeons proved to be an excellent source of food with their meat and eggs. Their feathers were also valuable, and yes, even their droppings found use back in the day. Doves even had religious value, being associated with the Holy Spirit. Pigeons, on the other hand, are a menace to society and need to be stopped at all costs. Thank you for listening to my PSA. Gotcha, you little rascal. You were gonna keep watching this video without slapping that like and subscribe button, weren't you? That's fine. I guess you can do that. But gee, we would really all appreciate it if you just gave those buttons a little poke. And then we can poke back with more of these videos. Deal? Alright, moving on. Number 6, the buttery. I can't believe it's not butter. Well, believe it, sister. This has nothing to do with butter. No, in fact, the name actually comes from beer butts, otherwise known as barrels. The room itself was located pretty close to the main hall, where yeomen would serve beer to the people who were too low in the ladder to be allowed to have wine. And it was usually connected to the beer cellar down below. How is this unholy? Because, I don't know about you, but I've never done a single holy thing after a few beers.
And speaking of Christianity, how about a church position called the Sluggard Wakers, which is quite the name. Guess the only thing worse for the church's holy sanctuary than dangerous stray dogs was the presence of conked out parishioners. Sluggard Wakers were volunteers that patrolled the pews and ensured that none of the congregation was falling asleep when they should be praising their Lord. They were literally Jesus snitches. If you were caught dozing off during the service, the Sluggard Waker had the sacred duty to wallop you on the head, and not lightly. The sleeper usually clobbered with something like a club, a rod, or a switch bundle. Some of the more aggressive Sluggard Wakers used forks or brass-tipped staffs or metal knobs to do the job. The sting of rebuke was supposed to wake you and remind you to remain awake and vigilant for your Lord. Jesus wasn't sleeping on you, now is he? No. Some Sluggard Wakers were volunteer members of the congregation. Some Wakers were members of the church staff, such as the parish clerk. Other Wakers were also knock-nobblers, because when there were no dogs to drive off, there were likely congregants to wake up. I should probably explain all the dogs in church talk I'd be doing, so knock-nobblers are next. Medieval Europeans lived in filth. Their structures all sucked, and so did their economy. Does it really surprise you that the church would just have its doors wide open? Does it really surprise you if they didn't have windows? Of course animals can get in, so knock-nobblers had the unique task of chasing wild dogs out of the church to protect the congregation, especially the priest who's most at risk while holding the full loaves of bread for service. Elderly men holding warm loaves of bread were probably some very easy prey for a hungry, unscrupulous wild dog. And as someone who survived being mauled by a dog, the terrifying reality is once they're on you, it can be incredibly difficult to get them off. So this job would actually be super necessary. Always remember, protect the face and neck. So a noble knocker was given a whip and a pair of dog tongs. The whip was used just to scare the dogs away. The tong was used to clasp the animal from a safe distance so they could be removed from property. Their methods and ideology were the precursors to modern animal control departments and their tools. Knock-nobblers didn't stop there though. If wild dogs weren't running around, they would instead turn their attention to unruly and disobedient children. If scolding didn't work, the knock-nobbler would remove the child from service too. The amount of avoidable child screaming I've heard at a synagogue dog? Yo, I feel like we should just bring this back. I love this job. Before the phone book, the pocketbook, a BlackBerry, or even gasp, Apple, was the nomenclator. We all know the person, or are the person, who cannot remember names or dates to save their literal life. If that is the case, you'd be better suited hiring one of these guys rather than working as one. Nomenclators were serfs tasked with remembering other people's names, status, and important impressive details for their lords at public events. This way you aren't carrying a quill and parchment around for reference, and imagine how much more impressive it is for the fair damsels that you remember her address and her father's companies just like that. Or, well, at least the dude standing next to you does for you, but whatever. Sometimes the nomenclator's job would be hiked up a notch and they would have to remember more information for their master because homeboy got drunk or zooted. This could be details from prior conversations, plans to meet someone somewhere, things they've lied about and now you have to upkeep for them. Even just basic information about the individuals your master has been speaking to throughout the evening. Essentially, nomenclators were phone books before it was cool and embarrassment prevention babysitters. No better thing to title it, so let's just call it by its name, Piss Prophet. The Piss Prophet, also called a water scriger because, oh, that's so much better, was a doctor who diagnosed disease from the sight, smell, and taste of a patient's urine. This term seems to originate from the 1600s, but the profession itself dates back to the medieval era. Now, I gotta play devil's advocate a little bit because scientifically this isn't quite as insane as it sounds. Some conditions can really be diagnosed with urine alone, such as diabetes, which makes urine sweet. And as we would all know, dehydration causes strong, dark-colored urine, and UTIs can leave blood in urine. If you and I can recognize at least two of those things from sight without our doctor present, it's not totally gross that they give it a little dip and a lick. And now we're cutting the crossroads. Hey, so wanna hear a fun sentence? Samurai sometimes tested swords by attacking random passerbys. Yeah, so in medieval Japan, it was considered dishonorable if a samurai sword couldn't cut through an opponent's body in one stroke. It was important then for a samurai to know about the quality of his weapon, so every new sword he got had to be tested before he took into battle. Naturally, it's gotta be a realistic test too. So samurai mostly practiced this through and through cut style on corpses or on criminals. That's normal, kinda what you would expect, but corpses need to be whole in their culture, so not many people wanted to just offer theirs up for the chop chop. And well, Japan has some efficient execution methods that were a lot more painful and slow for the criminals and taught the public a lot more. So you would never guess what the method was lined up to fill that void instead, and somehow legally approved, condoned, and excused as a ceremonial way to go. Sujigiri translated means crossroad killing because the targets were random everyday commoners who were minding their own business and happened to need to walk through an intersection at night the way that we all do at some point. And samurai would quite literally chop these people down. Bodies would be found by others or in the early morning, and there was never anyone to blame, and you technically couldn't be angry or seek revenge. This was government approved and sanctioned activity. Incidents of sujigiri were rare in the early medieval period, but began to pick up in the 1200s when more sociopathic or psychopathic samurai started to, pun intended, overkill it. By the Warring States period, the end of the medieval era, sujigiri became a dishonorable act. Samurai and kabukimono rogues turned it into a horrific popular pastime. In fact, one Edo-era report from the year 1600 details the early years of the period, claiming that people were killed in sujigiri every night on certain crossroads in what's now modern-day Tokyo. This continued to escalate, so the authorities felt they had to ban it in 1602, only a few decades after the medieval period finally ended.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Pope Gregory IX. Pope Gregory IX was the Bishop of Rome and the ruler of the Papal States from 1227 until his passing in 1241. The Papal States were a series of territories in the Italian peninsula that were under direct rule of the Pope from the 8th century all the way to 1870. It turns out that Pope Gregory IX had a very strange hatred for cats. He said that black cats were actually instruments of Satan, which seems a little extreme, but then he actually went as far as to order that they be exterminated throughout Europe, which is definitely a little extreme. With this order, the Pope's followers had to oblige, and there was a drastic reduction in the cat population. But of course, this caused a disturbance to the ecosystem, and the time and the consequence of that became very evident. Because of the decline of cats, there was a sudden increase in the amount of rats, most of which may have been carrying the plague. There are a lot of historians who would argue that this war on cats may have had a huge effect on the severity of the Black Plague. That is of course speculation, speculation, as it's pretty difficult to pinpoint who could be at fault for something like that, but it certainly is a very interesting point. This all really does, however, bring me to my next point. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Black Death. I'm sure we've all heard of the Black Death at some point or another. I mean, how could we possibly ever stop talking about something like that? During the 1340s, there was an outbreak of the bubonic plague that spread rapidly throughout Europe and Asia. It was called the Black Plague because of the fact that this illness would cause people's lymph nodes to become swollen and black. The Black Death was absolutely terrible, and it caused a lot of agony for those who had to go through it. Symptoms included things like severe body aches, fever, vomiting, and eventual death in most cases. There was no cure for the plague, so it just continued to spread. In the end, the Black Death took the lives of hundreds of millions of people. We now all know firsthand what it is like to live through a pandemic, and I certainly wouldn't sign up to do it again anytime soon, so I'm most definitely sure the times of the Black Death were some of the worst times in history. Apparently, it is said that if you lived in the 1340s, there was basically a 50-50 chance that you'd survive the Black Death. And then on top of that, there's all of the other horrifying ways to die that the medieval times held. All in all, I'm kinda shocked that we're still here today. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Mongol invasion. Being in China during the Mongol invasion certainly was a terrifying time. I'm sure a lot of us here have heard at least some of the stories surrounding Genghis Khan, but if you haven't, let's just say that being on his bad side certainly wasn't a good thing for you. In 1205, when the Mongol invasion in China began, it was the regular citizens of China who paid the ultimate price. What was started by Genghis Khan was carried on by his son and then his grandson, which ultimately led to a 74-year-long campaign that was filled with brutality and destruction. Cities and towns were destroyed, empires were brought down, and millions of completely innocent people lost their lives. It is believed that this invasion took the lives of enough people to cut the population in half from 120 million before to just 60 million after. Anyone living in China at this time would have had to live in absolute fear of being killed for something that you really had nothing to do with. That would be awful and absolutely terrifying. In our number 7 spot today, we have Pope Formosus and Pope Stephen VI. Pope Formosus was the ruler of the Papal States from October 6th, 891 until he passed away on April 4th, 896. After his passing, Pope Boniface VI took his place as ruler for just a few weeks before he also passed away, which then left Pope Stephen VI as the ruler from then on until his death. After this whirlwind April of 1896, things got even weirder. Before his passing, Pope Formosus had sided with Arnulf of Carinthia against Lambert of Spoleto, which was definitely not okay with Pope Stephen VI. So, once Pope Stephen VI gets to the place of being the ruler, he gets the people to exhume the body of Pope Formosus so that he can put him on trial. I feel like this is very gross and very unnecessary, but this really is the type of stuff that went on in the 800s. They propped the body up for trial and had a deacon answer questions for him since he obviously was unable to do that himself. They ended up finding the corpse guilty, which seems a little unfair, and they actually went as far as to strip the body of its sacred vestments, took 3 fingers from the right hand as they were the blessing fingers. They dressed the body in regular people clothes instead of the clothing a pope would be buried in, and then they reburied the body. If this poor man's body hadn't been through enough, it was later re-exhumed again and thrown into the river. If this story wasn't already wild enough, this whole debacle is actually what would later end up getting Pope Stephen imprisoned and then killed. Alright, so I guess the other pope had his justice in the end. I don't know, man. In our number 6 spot today, we have King Charles VI. King Charles VI started off his reign by being very well loved and respected, but as time went on over his 4 decades of ruling, he ended up being known as Charles the Mad. His erratic behavior had him hacking up nights, imagining that he was St. George, and he would also have bouts of amnesia where he would be able to recognize some people, but not his wife and children. This is all very strange and of course quite sad, as he was obviously exhibiting signs of extreme mental illness, but one of the strangest symptoms was him believing that he was made of glass. He was terribly frightened of falling or being jostled too hard, and he would actually insert iron rods into his clothing to try and keep himself from shattering. But then he would also apparently run wild at top speeds throughout the halls of the castle or the streets, which would obviously mean that he was completely abandoning his fear of fragility. It apparently got so bad that he had to be held inside with the entrances blocked off. Sadly, he continued on this path until he passed away in 1422.
Number 5. The bedroom handbook. Like previously said before, when you marry someone, it's for life. You learn to love and you do the bedroom dance with that same person for the rest of your life. For some folks, this was their first time, and as we all know and remember, that can be awkward. Well, imagine if you had a booklet or an instruction manual on what to do when that time comes, like a Lego manual. Although sometimes even those can be a little confusing. I always have to count the pieces. I get it confused. Well, some churches back in the oldie times were doing such a thing. The Summe Confessorum, as it was known to be called. It detailed exactly on what days were allowed to make the devil's dance possible. By the time all the rules were read and followed, you were boiled down to a small window, about once a week, or sometimes none at all. And especially not on Sundays. Ooh, you better not do that on Sunday, man. Ooh, that's the wrong time to do it. Never do it on Sunday. Number 4, Dragonborn? This is actually kind of cool. So, in Viking and Norse weddings, there was a very unique tradition. We'll call it a tradition where the very handsome and brave groom would be tasked with a quest. Like something right out of Skyrim, actually. The groom was tasked with entering his family tomb and retrieving and/or placing a ceremonial blade that acknowledges him tying the knot. Now, is that as cool as fighting off drogers and emptying literally every urn you see in search of gold and amethyst? No, it's not. However, I can't recommend entering anyone's grave before the invention of modern medicine. It's just not a great idea. But still cool nonetheless, hence it's on the list. Listen, I just got married. You on Grandpa's tomb, can grab that knife, just go in there. Just go Grandpa died of smallpox. That's okay though. Go in there and grab it, no problem. You come out, I got it. Anyway, number 3, royal weddings. While poorer class citizens did sometimes marry for love and support, and to have someone to go through life with, as being a woman on her own back then would prove to be quite difficult. Sometimes difficult more than it should have been. Medieval times set a very troubling precedent for those at the top. A lot of times, princes, princesses, kings, queens, and really anyone who held power or land were oftentimes married off to benefit that of a nation or a kingdom from which they came. In a nutshell, these marriages were political agreements, not holy matrimony, if you can call it that. Many times in history, nations swapped sons and daughters in order to save a little skin. Some marriages might go sour over time, but imagine one that you didn't want to be in from the start. Oof. And if you speak up, your whole kingdom might collapse. Yeah, not a good time, not a good scenario. Number 2, witnesses. I've talked about it before, but it still doesn't make it any better or easier. Every person you see walking around today was created by a couple things. 2 people, a Barry White record, and a little bit of friction. Unless you're a test tube baby. Sometimes, like you're a clone in Camino, you know what I mean? And Star Wars, you know, the big tube thing? Anyway, that's life. However, a lot of these moments are private, and they probably should be private, unless you're an exhibitionist or something. That's how you do things. Well, a lot of times for a marriage to become official, established members from your village or community would come and watch you consummate the marriage. Yes, that's right. Mom, dad, the bishop, heck, maybe even the gravedigger down the road because he's got an important job. My question is, what do you say when that's happening? Do you cheer? Do you laugh? Do you... Way to go, kid. That's my boy. What do you do? It's so gross and Close the door, Dad. Number 1, divorce by trial. My personal favorite on this list, divorce by trial or divorce by combat. Either or, same thing. It's exactly what it sounds like. What if divorce court had a little less paper signing and a little more club swinging? Sprinkle in a little bit of Hunger Games and bam boom, you got yourself a medieval divorce. It was a fight until you had to call Dompe the gravedigger. The wife had a sling and a stone, the man had a club and was stuck in a hole waist deep just to even the odds. May the better spouse win. Whoever was left alive afterwards got to be live free, and then now they were divorced because the other spouse was no longer breathing. Who would have thought? Who would have known? That's crazy. Alright guys, that's gonna wrap it up for me today. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe here at Bumblebee. And if you too want to sit in a hole with your arm behind your back and swing a club around, then check out my socials somewhere down below. I stream sometimes. Come check me out on Instagram and Twitch. It's really fun sometimes.
Kicking off our list at number 10, the London Tornado. We've all heard about the Great Fire of London in 1666. So let's talk about another horrible event from history, shall we? That's why I'm here, after all. On October 16th, 1091, harsh winds from the southwest took out more than 600 houses and a handful of churches. There was a mighty tornado. The Church of St. Mary was a rather unholy place to be on that specific day. The tornado killed 2 men in this building and it tore up the roof, and timbers went everywhere. The rafters were actually ripped from the structure, then slammed down far away back into the earth. Turns out historically about half of these rafters were buried in the dirt. That's how much force was thrashing them about. Tornadoes are so scary. I feel a strong wind outside and I'm immediately back inside. That's it. I'm shaking in my boots. I don't mess with wind. Number 9, the Great Drowning of Men. Such a tragic name, my lord. How about we take out the word great and all these references, maybe? I don't know. It's kind of horrible. In the Middle Ages, coastal areas around the North Sea were hotspots for flooding. Now, historically, there were numerous reports of flooding here, and for some reason, between the 11th and 15th centuries, this area would get absolutely destroyed. It would get completely swamped. And it's even larger than you can possibly imagine. The St. Marcellus flood took place on January 16th, 1362. Now, the death toll here, I mean, obviously it's impossible to tell for sure, but historians believe it was at least 25,000 people. That's horrible. Atlantic gales were to blame for the rush of water, because this event also goes hand in hand with the Great Wind of 1362. The Great Wind, awesome. The Mighty Wind, like it's not great at all. It's not really good. Number 8, one name. This next one here blows my mind. I never really thought about this before, but what was it like before we had surnames? Surnames were introduced to us in England in 1066, but before then, well, you were just Greg, period. That's it. There was another Greg, well, that was it. Now you guys had to fight till the death. No, I'm just kidding. At first, surnames were a little bit different. They were descriptions almost about the person you were meeting. So you'd meet a guy and he would say, hey, I'm Greg Red. Red signified his red hair. Makes sense. Greg Red, Greg Gray, he's getting a little old. Got it, Gregs, we're good. But the best part, your name could actually change over time because your description and then your appearance would also change. So one day you would meet Greg Red, but eventually his hair would fall out, he would age, then get stressed because, you know, he's living in the medieval times and all. And then once that happens, your name would change to match your new description. Now you're Greg Ball. Ball back then meant bald in Middle English, so everyone had the last name Ball. Isn't that amazing? Next video, I'll be Taylor Ball. I'll just be bald. Why not? Just change it up like Heisenberg. Number 7, medieval meals. Yes, I hope you're eating while you're watching this. If so, give it a thumbs up, take a big bite, and good luck. Seeing as the holidays just passed, I figured there's no better time to mention a medieval holiday tradition. I'm glad we don't do this one anymore. This one's pretty gross. Swans today, they're beautiful. We see them traveling in pairs, and we don't hunt them down because, well, that would be insane, right? Medieval days, swans were hot property. They were a delicacy of the upper classes. Christmas swan pie. Nice, here you go, for you and yours. Enjoy, Merry Christmas. I would be crying on Christmas Day if I saw this on the table. They would actually stuff swans with beef, which I personally don't recommend. Turkeys, I'm like, okay, that we've dealt with. Swans, I'm like, no, but they're in love. They mate for life. Do we eat both? Let's eat both, I guess. Other medieval meals included peacocks, cranes, turtle doves, sparrows, and herons. Herons? Imagine Christmas dinner as a heron lying on the table. You're like, really, Dad? I don't really want to eat this. This is a long neck. Number 6, the dancing plague. Okay, summer 1518, a summer we will never forget, sadly. One of the most bizarre events in medieval history, the dancing plague. The town of Strasbourg was calm, cool, and or collect until out of nowhere, one woman began to dance uncontrollably in the streets. She was convulsing, it was wild, but then soon others joined in and eventually there were over 400 people dancing their days away. Now it sounds funny in some degree, but it's really tragic. This was not a good time at all. A great amount lost their lives due to pure exhaustion and heart attacks, and the authorities tried their best to help the situation, so they paid for musicians to perform for them while they danced, while they were convulsing. They're like, oh yes, bring in a jazz band, let's complete this image. This happened a few times in Europe, not just once. Between the 14th and the 17th centuries, we still don't know what exactly happened, but there were dance plagues. It was a common occurrence. All we know is that it was some sort of illness. It was not like Step Up. It wasn't a fun thing like Step Up at all. No one's just popping and locking in the streets. They're like, hey, nice, let's bring in some music. This is great. No, people were very sick. They were very ill.
Number 5, assassination. Let's say for a second you ain't such a bad guy. Let's say you're a king that everyone likes. You listen to the people's woes of hunger and pain. You distribute the wealth, and your fashion isn't too ridiculous for the time. And I'll get to that later, because that's definitely a point. You care, which for the time is rare. Well, that's too bad, because a lot of men in history, whether they were loved, hated, or something in between, there's always someone lurking around the corner waiting to pour poison in your ear whilst you sleep. Yes, the art of assassination, or at least as I'm told it from ninja movies and Assassin's Creed. Many have and will succumb to an assassin, whether it was for political, financial, or just crazy reasons. It happens, and for some reason, no one ever expects to hit him blades. Well, I know I know, Ezio, and I would never let my guard down for a second to allow that to happen. Alright, we're good, we're fine. Just checking. Number 4, boiling in oil. Okay, let's just say you got caught in a Shakespearean crime of attempting to poison your king. Something about poison in the ear or something. Oh, do not fear, good friends, because you better call Ched. That's right, your internet lawyer. Doctor, fireman too. Don't forget that, I'm a doctor and a fireman. I do it all, folks. Well, I'd come to defend you in trial, but this isn't exactly a time for fair trials and innocence until proven guilty. And the opposite. I mean, come on, you got off easy, kid. They're just gonna boil you in oil, it's easy. Roaring flames, big metal pot, and they're slowly gonna dip you in. Won't be that bad. You'll be screaming in pure agony for 5-10 minutes tops. What's the worst that could happen? Well, it'll be the worst pain that you've ever felt in your entire life, but hey, at least you'll look like a Popeye's drumstick later, am I right? Anyway, kid, if you need my legal service again, just give me a call. If you can. I had to go help this bald guy in an RV, something about a lab, I don't know. Good luck! Number 3, men's fashion. I know it was a long time ago, but what the heck happened? Calves were in, they like big calves for some reason, I don't know why. I got big calves, you know what I'm saying? And so were Wario shoes, because Wario. As much as I love Wario, since I basically am him, I mean, that doesn't mean I want to look like and feel like him. Longer the shoes, the higher the social status. Weird, right? I know. This was also the era of tunics, and if there's anything I've learned from watching Hollywood movies, and I've learned a lot, it's that you don't trust a guy in a tunic. So, if everyone around you was wearing a tunic, who the heck can you trust? Sheesh. No wonder kings were so paranoid. Except for Link, he's cool. We can trust him. We like Link from Zelda, he's pretty sick. As for poor men and serfs, you wore basically whatever you could make or afford, which isn't much. There's no long shoes in the potato fields. I'll stick to my plaid. Lots of plaid. I can't help it, I'm Canadian. Number 2, the rack. Ever just wake up one morning and give a big old stretch because it's Saturday morning, you got to sleep in, the sun's shining, and your bones feel warm from a little bit of sun that's just creeping through from the window. You take a deep breath of fresh air and walk downstairs to your fridge to prepare a feast for breakfast, fit for a king. To think of a day like that starts with a stretch. Well, medieval men got to stretch too, thanks to the help of a device called the rack. Think of a ratchet strap, except instead of your dad yelling at you to make sure the trailer's strapped down, you're the strap that's being stretched. Yes, the rack was a means of torment. Basically, your ankles were tied down at one end, your wrists were tied down at the other, and a large sweaty man turns a gear, and then you get stretched out like a pair of jeans you haven't worn since high school. No, that's right, I know. No, you can keep trying them on, but they ain't gonna fit. That's okay, keep telling yourself that, that's fine. Mine don't fit either. Number 1, bloodletting. This is just always so weird to me. I just don't do well with blood at all, actually. I got some stories about that. Maybe for another day. But basically, there was this medical practice floating around back then. If you were sick, not well, or you just needed a refresh, a medical professional, and I use that term loosely, a medical professional would treat your veins the same way your dad treats a Ford Bronco getting an oil change. Ooh, gross. Did it help? Not really. Am I getting lightheaded just thinking about it? Yes, I am actually. And I'm being for real, I get lightheaded thinking about it. Not even kidding on that one. For real, getting woozy.
Number 10. The Doomsday Book, 1085. The Doomsday Book was created under William I, also known as William the Conqueror. Like, you're already the first, man. You don't need 2 names, come on. This guy basically drew up a book to document people's money so that he could tax them. Oh yeah, this is the very first time surveyors went town to town and recorded how much money you would owe for simply just doing you. Men would show up at your house asking how much money you made and document your spending habits. 5 shillings on groceries, huh? Okay. And 5 on that phone plan. Look, tax season's coming up, Arthur. It's not looking good, man. Talk about a bunch of crooks, huh? Imagine owing someone money for just trying to make an honest living. Yeah, thank God that didn't catch on, right guys? Oh, speaking of, I gotta phone H&R Block. Number 9, The Crusades. A 3-part miniseries spanning over 200 years. These bloody and ruthless wars were battled between Muslim and Christians for the proprietorship over sacred sites and the land in the East Mediterranean. A 3-part miniseries spanning over 200 years. These bloody and ruthless wars were battled between Muslim and Christians for proprietorship over sacred sites and land in the East Mediterranean. Wars that resulted in 6 million deaths. The Knights Templar, a brotherhood of highly trained soldiers horseback bashing their way through the East. These guys were the real deal, almost like the Navy SEALs of their time. We've seen these paintings. The elite fighting force with the Red Cross painted on their chests. I wonder if they had to do a Hell Week. These soldiers were the most trained and savage fighters in all the Christian armies. Richard I leading the third and final crusade, earning him the name Richard the Lionheart. Back then the names were always something so aggressive and scary. It was never like Richard the Clownfish or Henry the Pygmy Goat. No, we need fear. Way more fear. Number 8. The Magna Carta. The year's 1215. We need some laws, people. This document was one of its kind. A document setting out the laws and limitations from the common man to King John himself. A legal system written down so that there are clear do's and don'ts. No free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, nor in any way proceeded against except by the lawful judgment of his peers, and the law of the land. Did you get all that? Write that down. Except women. They don't have laws. And they can't act in plays. Sometimes people needed to face the music. And even animals. Huh? That's right, animals. Being tried in a court. A lively and popular event trying any law-breaking animal from goats to pigs to even chickens. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, did you, Mr. Feathersworth, peck the floor, yes or no? Objection, Your Honor, leading the witness. My brain can't fathom this, guys. Number 7. The Battle of Bannockburn. This infamous battle between Scotland and England was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages. The end of the bloody war for independence. Basically, Scotland was like, yeah, we're gonna go over here and roll our R's. The gruesome wooden wars were caused by the English invading Scotland in 1296. A leader slowly rising the ranks, William Wallace, the guardian of the King of Scotland himself, holds off the English forces and is knighted a hero to Scotland. Unfortunately, like every hero back then, he was also hated. He was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Like, why do you have to do all that after he dies? Like, he's dead. Not fun. The battles between Scotland and England ended in 1314 with Robert the Bruce securing Scotland's independence, adding like 45 more dialects to the UK. Freedom! Number 6. The Black Death. Ooh, talk about a curveball. The year's 1348. People are saying things like, don't let the bed bugs bite. Clearly not a very clean and safe time. The Black Death, aka pestilence, aka the Great Mortality, or simply known as the Plague. Single-handedly the worst pandemic ever recorded in history, wiping out somewhere between 70 to 200 million people. Ooh, now I get where bless you comes from. Someone sneezed back then and everyone's dead at 14. This is where we see those doctors in the terrifying bird outfits with the long noses stuffed with garlic and herbs. Excuse me? Yeah, he's not wearing the mask. I'm just trying to watch a cat publicly get skinned. Yeah, 6 feet please. Some doctors prescribed urinating on a person so that the bad smell would drive out the infection. Can you imagine? Just a doctor writing you up a script and go ahead and pee on yourself about 4 to 5 times a day. Take with food. Should be gone early next week. And just let me put my mask back on here before you leave. There you are. The plague started in Europe in October 1347 when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. Most sailors aboard the ships were already dead, but those who were still alive were covered head to toe in black boils that oozed pus and blood. Ugh. Sometimes the Black Death included fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, temporary loss in motor skills, and then of course, death.
Number 5, marriage. Many people have this idea of lavish weddings being a huge thing in the medieval ages, and while that was eventually the case, the fact remains that it wasn't entirely true, at least not at the start. In fact, weddings actually became this big ordeal because people became confused about who was married and who wasn't, with people actually not even needing permission back in the day to get married and simply needing to exchange like basically a little vow to be considered wed. And because that could happen just about anywhere, private or public, it became very hard for people to keep track of, which is why we had to have a whole to-do about it. And it's also why people had to witness the consummation of marriages. That was also part of people just being like, you know what, we just gotta make sure this is happening. Yikes. Number 4, animals on trial. One of the strangest things by far to have happened in the medieval ages was the persecution of animals. Among them, pigs were apparently the most likely to be put on trial, and sadly, many were actually convicted of the crimes that they were accused of. At one point, a pig was even dressed up as a human for its own execution. I feel like that's kind of fitting considering really humans were the criminals here, I'm sure, in this case. So why not make the pig look like a human if you're going to convict it of a crime, you know what I mean? Really, who are the criminals on Earth? I feel like we're probably those people. No animals were seemingly exempt in France, even dolphins were
apparently put on trial, and I've heard stories of lawyers waiting for their clients, the rats, to attend court, only to be frustrated when they didn't show up to trial. Like, hey, we called those rats. We sent them a letter. What, rats can't read now all of a sudden? Oh, isn't that convenient? If rats ever been able to read, how would sending them a letter to summon them to court? It's so ridiculous. I know being a lawyer back in the day probably didn't carry with it quite the same prestige as it does now. But just imagine becoming a lawyer only to have to defend a rat on trial being accused of eating crops. Man, you'd be like, why did I become a lawyer again? I wonder how they decided which lawyer gets that case too. I don't know, probably like you're the least experienced one and they're like, sorry, you're gonna have to do the rat trial. Ugh. Number 3, courtly love. This one is shocking in kind of a nice way, so I thought I'd include it here to provide some levity and surprise you about some of the things from the medieval ages that actually sound, well, I mean, kinda nice. While more physical intimacy was of course saved for marriage, love was also believed to be something that could be shared among multiple partners. Now in court, there was a type of love that was known as courtly love, which was all about celebrating the love of friends and those close to us in even a romantic sense. There were even rules made up for how to do courtly love properly. These are the rules of courtly love. This is how we do it. One of the rules even read, marriage is no real reason for not loving. Honestly, true. Super adorable. Acknowledging that most marriages were forged for political or monetary reasons and not for love, with courtly love you could basically hold hands, dance, and even laugh with other people outside of your marriage. It was basically the people at court being like, yeah, we know that none of us are married to each other because we actually like each other. Of course, you still couldn't sleep with your courtly love partners. That was still forbidden and considered a sin. But even the idea of loving someone outside of marriage, even by today's standards, might seem taboo or unheard of. Especially if we're talking about people like holding hands and giggling together. Yet back then, it was actually just part of the courtly lifestyle, which in a weird way is kind of progressive. Number 2, the Children's Holy Crusade. If you're thinking about the Holy Crusade and also thinking that it doesn't seem like something children should be involved in, you would be right. But here we are. This was actually a holy crusade that was attempted to be started by a child. Although to be accurate, back in the medieval ages there were many living adult lives who by today's standards would still be considered kids. However, even with that context, keeping that in mind, this is still a pretty wild and terrible story, I gotta say. There was a boy named Stephen who was apparently 12 at the time that led this crusade, or attempted to anyways. When he went to King Philip of France seeking support and claiming that he had been spoken to by Jesus Christ himself and told to go on this holy mission to the Holy Land, Philip refused to aid Stephen and instead told him, hey Stephen, you know what, maybe you should go home. You're only 12, man. But despite not getting royal or adult support, Stephen did not stop. He continued on, gaining another child leader to his cause by the name of Nicholas. Apparently thousands of kids joined them both on their mission, although it's believed very few, if any, actually made it to the Holy Lands. We still don't really know what ended up happening to all the members of this crusade, the thousands of them, though it is believed many of them never made it back home to tell the tale of their adventure. So, pretty terrible. How did we just be like, yeah, go for it? I don't know. Seems like a weird thing. I guess no one was saying go for it, the kids were just doing their own thing. Number 1, corpses on trial. If you thought putting animals on trial was ridiculous and inhumane, well you're definitely right. Guess what? It somehow gets weirder than that. In this case, Pope Stephen VI decided one day to put the previous pope, Pope Formosus, on trial. The problem? Pope Formosus was not only already excommunicated at this point, but he was also very dead. The trial went down in history as one of the most ridiculous trials ever and ended up with Pope Stephen finding Formosus guilty, stripping him of the clothes he was basically buried in, removing his blessing fingers, and reburying him. Only to change his mind, unbury him, and then toss him into the Thames. Needless to say, Pope Stephen's reign did not last even a full year, and by the end of it he himself was also dead, having been mysteriously strangled after being imprisoned. I wonder why. I wonder who did that.
At number 10, baby night. I know that when someone asks a little kid what they want to be when they grow up, some of them might respond with saying something like a princess or a cowboy or a knight, but back in the medieval age, kids were really becoming knights, not just when they grew up. Knights started training when they were between the ages of 7 and 10, so their childhoods were pretty short-lived. In this day and age, kids that age are starting elementary school and are still too short to ride most rides at the theme park, but back in the day, they were being trained to go off to war. Sounds like a pretty sucky situation, but it gets even worse when you realize that most of these young knights didn't even get a choice in the matter. Parents back then controlled what their kids' futures were going to look like, and there was nothing that their kids could do or say about it, so if they were to be trained as a knight and go off to war, that's exactly what was going to happen. At number 9, squires. Now, even though kids as young as 7 years old would be shipped off to train as a knight, luckily no one was going to send these kids out into battle just yet. Before they could even think about seeing the battlefield, they had to go through training. First, they started off as pages. The pages mostly did menial tasks like working in the stables and serving food to the knights, but they also learned to ride horses and use a sword. A few years later, when they were about 14 years old, they would graduate to become a squire, where they were assigned to a specific knight, sort of like an assistant. The squire would do some pretty menial tasks for their assigned knight, and they would clean and polish the knight's armor and sword, tend to the knight's horse, and help the knight get into their armor for battle. Most squires got through these tasks with the dream that one day they would become a knight themselves and have a squire of their own, but unfortunately in some cases, some squires never became knights, and they stayed a squire even past the age of 18, when most squires would become knights. Seems a little unfair to me, but I guess in that case you wouldn't be burdened with the knowledge that you could die on the battlefield, since you would never make it there. At number 8, training. When you picture what it would look like to see squires training, what do you imagine? Do you picture kids fighting with wooden swords or practicing how to put on armor? Well, you can put that out of your mind, because that image is more sunshine and rainbows than what actually went on, because training to be a knight was a very grueling process. When a page graduated to become a squire, they then had to master the 7 points of agility. The 7 points of agility were sort of like sports that would help the squires become good knights. They had to master shooting, fencing, wrestling, riding horses, swimming and diving, climbing, long jumping, and tournament sports like jousting and dancing. Yes, that is more than 7, but let's just agree that medieval math was flawed and not think about it too hard. Other than the physical skills that they had to master, squires also had to learn how to recite poetry, hunt, play chess, and impress the ladies, because even though they were going to be slaying people on the battlefield, they still needed to be able to win a woman's heart. Unfortunately, even with all of this training, many young knights died in their first battles, but at least they tried their best, right? At number 7, too much poop. Here's a real downside to being a knight in the medieval era. While we've been taught that knights were these amazing, brave, chivalrous men that would rescue a princess and live happily ever after, the reality is that they were actually a bunch of dudes on a muddy battlefield with poor hygiene that were literally pooping themselves to death. Many knights who embarked on crusades had a lot of parasites and diseases, and one illness that proved most problematic was dysentery. Dysentery is an illness that basically causes super poops due to a parasite. So these knights were out trying to win back the Holy Lands while their tum-tums were throwing up gang signs getting mad rumbly on the battlefield. It is believed that these knights contracted dysentery through drinking tainted water, and because medicine was basically a myth at this point, once you contracted dysentery, you could basically kiss your life goodbye and your stomach contents goodbye. The most famous case of death by butt explosion was from the 7th Crusade, where Louis IX had contracted dysentery and had his pants cut because he was tired of having to pull them down every time he felt a rumbly in his tumbly. This all sounds like such a horrible way to go and a serious downside to being a knight. At number 6, armor. We all have a pretty good idea of what knights looked like, right? The shiny metal armor, the chainmail and helmet. Well, as cool as they may have looked, the armor that knights wore was actually pretty impractical when it came to agility, because there was just no way you could move very easily when wearing it. These knights had to carry around a lot of weight. Hollywood made us believe that swords that knights used were incredibly heavy, but in reality they only weighed about 3 to 5 pounds. Yeah, they were pretty hefty, but nowhere near the kind of weight that knights were carrying on their bodies because of their armor. The average medieval suit of armor weighed between 45 and 55 pounds, and just the helmet alone weighed 4 to 8 pounds. Knights on the battlefield had to worry about fighting, staying alive, and carrying an extra 45 pounds on them, but knights who jousted had it even worse because their armor was known to weigh twice as much as battle armor. These knights had to be very strong in order to carry that around, otherwise they would have collapsed under the weight of their gear when they got too tired to keep going.
Number 5 is the legal protection of claiming sanctuary. Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame depicts an iconic scene of Quasimodo swinging around on rope dramatically over the burning base of the Notre. Having just saved Esmeralda from an execution, he holds her aloft in the cathedral's turrets and screams out, "Sanctuary!" Sanctuary actually predates Christianity Christianity and originates far back into the 300s and existed until the 16th century. Every medieval law folded to the protections of sanctuary no matter the criminal's crime. Now, sanctuary-seeking criminals might have been required to perform penance or go into exile, but they were at least guaranteed immunity from punishment. That's right, you could literally strangle someone and then run to the church to claim sanctuary and no one could come in and harm, arrest, or remove you for punishment. Sanctuary was abolished due to the new tide of judicial law and the arguments of crime, power, and punishment. Also because people should be punished for, I don't know, maybe taking someone else's life. Originally, before Christianity, it was temples such as the ones in Greek and Rome offering the solace, and it was part of the Roman law by the end of the 4th century to have it. Christianity adopted this practice to try and persuade people to join their religion when it started. Even after the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, churches maintained their authority to protect people who had broken major secular laws. Number 4, let's meet the Yellow Ladies. Venice, Italy was an important trading post. Many people came and went, many travelers came to see the great city, but for those who had been at sea for a while, they may have wanted to see a little something else. As a result, medieval Venice was a massive red light district, enjoyed by many before their next voyages. Trying to control the number of ladies working the streets, the Venetian government mandated in 1360 that brothels must be concentrated in the market and port districts. Obviously, that just made their industry boom more since it was concentrated right where all the money came in and not dispersed, requiring men to travel farther out in convenient ways. Angry now that they weren't at least getting to capitalize off the potential tax revenue of these women, they in 1420 decided to be accommodative of their Lady of the Night friends. The Venetian government accommodated more red light districts and implemented safety means within them, as well as the law of yellow. All women of the trade were to wear shades of yellow so as to be identifiable to their clientele, so random ladies just out on a stroll who happen to be in the area don't get harassed. But also it's a little bit of that classic shame tactic of making someone unwanted easily identifiable for discrimination. Number 3 is the indigenous sumptuaries of Spain. As early as 1501, the crown warned natives who carried sword, dagger, or any other weapons that they faced confiscation and may be condemned to more punishments according to what the court sees fit. Spanish restrictions against natives developed through the 16th century. This mandate is no surprise as these items, while dangerous, complemented and enhanced men's fashions, and fashionable repairs became integral to everyday masculine attire in Europe. To the indigenous, they had been items of necessity to carry and often seen as symbolic. For indigenous men of the elite, the right to bear arms highlighted much more than their privileged status the way that it did for the colonizer. It demonstrated colonial acknowledgement of their once dominant standing on their original lands and partially vindicated their marginalized reality even as a royal. June 8, 1685, Don Diego Garcia, an indigenous leader of what's now Guerrero, had petitioned to the Viceroy of New Spain to intervene on his behalf when this sumptuary denied him the right his parents, grandparents, and ancestors had always possessed. Garcia was one of 505 petitions submitted by 277 towns between 1575 and 1693 demanding change. In response to a perceived disregard for the law, the monarchy reissued the restriction 6 more times over the course of the next 70 years. The items requested by Don Diego Garcia reflected both indigenous and European definitions of masculinity. By focusing on European attire and the personal weapons, Garcia took advantage of the social currency imposed by Spanish colonizers. As an elite, Garcia faced decreased political power and increased marginalization under a new regime. Garments and swords provided the ability to visually assert himself in everyday life. Ultimately, petitions submitted by Garcia and his peers reflected not just a request for special status items, but an attempt to assert their belonging as an elite man in a colonial life. Number 2 is just absurd, but you can club a Swede if they cross the frozen sea between Denmark and Sweden. What? This unusual law was imposed during the Dano-Swedish Wars of 1657 to 58. King Charles Gustav of Sweden had been planning to cross the Öresund by ship, but the freezing temperatures of January changed that plan. Frozen solid, the Swedes realized that they could simply just walk across. This completely caught the Danes off guard as no attack had been predicted until the spring, and they scrambled to compensate. Ultimately, the Danes signed the Treaty of Roskilde and yielded to the territory dispute. But ever since that day, should you see a Swede crossing over the frozen sea on foot, you are legally free to swing a big old club at him. And finally, at number 1, you either tuck it or you lose it. Medieval Wales was not playing around when it came to women being violated. If you were caught or perpetrator of this heinous crime, your options were to pay a dowry or get the little man chopped off. That's right, a violation such as this was actually considered a theft and was treated as such by the law. Should a perp pay the dowry, then legally the woman's virginity or body was restored in legal parameters. Can't or won't pay the fine? Well then, that was the end of down there for you. The reason for this, other than it being morally right, is that the fines and punishments hope to stop families from developing harmful feuds which would damage the wider society as a whole. This was not exclusive to Wales, however. This punishment shows up in the 1750s Code of Constantinian Marvodorcat in Eastern Europe. It was not unheard of for women to also simply just take the law into their hands either. In a rural area of Shropshire near the Welsh border in 1405, Isabella Graurinus and her 2 daughters ambushed her attacker in a field, tied him up, and did the dreaded snip snip, and stole his horses to boot. All 3 women were subsequently pardoned. Number 10 is sumptuary laws, which are the most common kind of medieval law, defined as laws made for the purpose of restraining luxury or extravagance, particularly against inordinate expenditures for apparel, food, furniture, and etc. Sumptuary laws were enacted for the purpose of regulating trade, but also regulate and reinforce social hierarchies by restricting foods, clothing, and luxury items. They did this so it was easy to identify someone's social rank and privilege in the name of good old-fashioned social discrimination and class division. Bourgeoisie subjects appearing to be as wealthy or as wealthier than ruling nobility could undermine the royals' presentations as the most powerful in the land. Why, that could cause traitors and thieves and revolts. In late medieval cities, sumptuary laws were instituted as a way for nobility to limit the conspicuous consumption of everyone, most specifically the prosperous bourgeoisie, while still making it about poor commoners enough for it to slip past them while they were busy poking fun at those below them. They missed out what the royals sneakily did above them. Cowardice tax law is number 9. Medieval knights weren't always volunteers. In fact, a grand majority of many kingdoms functioned off of what was essentially a drafting of their men into the service. So it makes sense that not everyone was as passionate about the idea of sieges or holy crusades or anything that could really get them wiped out in the name of a cause that just wasn't for them. So while it could be considered a great honor to be called to battle and you wanted to shirk your duty of obligation, you technically were able to pay a scourge, aka the cowardice tax, which originated in 1100. Essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card that you paid for with your own wage. Royalty started to lean into this new tax source, and by the 13th century it had evolved into a generalized tax on the knight's land. When the scourge tax reached 300%, the result of one king's want to force those to serve him all in a total Icarus flies too close to the sun fashion, it led to the implementation of the Magna Carta, which was forced onto royalty in the times to stunt their seemingly endless control and dictatorship. Sports banning is number 8. You've heard it in some of our other medieval videos, but we'll dive more into it now. Soccer and tennis were 2 banned sports of the medieval era. Handball, club ball, which is essentially baseball, hand fighting, which we could call boxing, I guess. This law, which was made in 1485, was due to the belief that British men were losing their legendary archery skills, and also that these sports led to the sin of gambling. Obviously, the rules didn't apply to royalty really, so tennis actually became an exclusively upper-class sport for its etiquette, complex rules, and equipment requirements. Meanwhile, football, as you may already know, was absolutely brutal. There was violence leading up to deaths and serious injuries, and it was often played drunk and recklessly. In 1388, a national statute demanded that servants and laborers throughout the country stop playing football and other sports and practice archery instead, the latter being necessary for the defense of the realm. They reopened the law in 1410 to add the punishment of 6 days imprisonment for violating this rule. Even then, it was only enforced sporadically as royals were still depicted playing this game during the time of its illegality. Unlike others, this law obviously is not still in place today. This older legislation concerning unlawful games was repealed in 1845. Number 7 says you're not for the streets if you do these things in them. There were a few smaller rules written in correlation with street behavior in medieval times. While it was okay to toss your feces just about anywhere, in 1839 a law imposed it be illegal to beat or shake any carpet or rug in the street. You can shake your doormat, however, but only before 8 AM in the morning. No carolers allowed then. It was illegal to sing songs and ballads in the street, especially if it was profane. And if you were to disturb the people by ringing doorbells or knocking on doors unexpectedly and unwantedly, Italy, you could be fined. Try enforcing that on Halloween. Meanwhile, in Scotland, it is still illegal to date to turn someone away if they knock at your door and ask to use your bathroom, no matter the time, place, age, or person. Spotted in a crowd is unfortunately number 6. Why unfortunately? Well, another fun, sumptuary law, and one of the earliest ever made in Europe, governed the appearance of minorities and social groups. Enacting laws stating specific dress codes for religions such as Jews or Muslims so that they were easily to be identified from other people. In English colonies, Muslims were told to wear a crescent-shaped brooch or badge, while Jews had to wear a similar badge, as well as a ring and a yellow cone-shaped hat. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty noticeable in a crowd. Alongside people who were Muslim or Jewish, the royals regulated laws of fashion towards people with certain diseases, those not following Christianity as a religion, orphans, and women of the night. Essentially, as you can tell, these were the unwanted peoples in the kingdom. So unfortunately, as mentioned, the point of these garbs was to make these people noticeable as social outcasts, so they may face mockery and degradation they didn't deserve for just simply existing.
Number 5. Shroud of Turin. They say art is subjective, but what does the Shroud of Turin really show us here? Is it JC? Is it Jesus Christ himself? Many believe the cloth shows an image of Jesus when he was crucified, and once you see it, it's hard to argue otherwise, hard to get out of your mind. Radiocarbon tests do date the cloth back to around 1260, and recent studies suggest that shroud was used in medieval church plays that would depict this exact scene, the resurrection of one Jesus Christ. What do you think? Accurate representation or another case of face pareidolia? Face pareidolia is when you see Jesus and things. I got our producer Chris. I see Jesus every day right there. A little bit more jacked than Jesus, but you know, same image, more or less. Number 4. Summer is cancelled. Back in 2013, scientists discovered a volcano on Lombok Island in Indonesia that went off sometime around May into October 1257, and scientists all agree that this eruption was the largest blast that the Earth had seen in 7,000 years, so it was quite a spectacle, a horrible spectacle. If that. Cut to the next year, 1258, the following cold temperatures ruined crops and brought famine to pretty much all of Europe. Cattle were all dying off quickly, it was far too cold for them to even stand a chance, and it's estimated that London saw 15,000 deaths that year alone. Experts believe that this volcanic eruption was a factor in the Little Ice Age that changed global temperatures from the 14th to 19th century. That's like if Yellowstone went off tomorrow. It would be a really bad time, and then afterwards would be almost worse, if anything. No resorts for a while, I think. Definitely not. Number 3, the Great Famine. The medieval adjective game, back again with the Great Famine. Awesome, another great. All of Northern Europe suffered the Great Famine in 1315, so only like 60 years after that volcano went off. I mean, like, what luck is that? What a terrible time to be alive. 1315 to 1317, 2 years of famine, countless lives were lost, and of course, with people losing hope, crime rate shot up to an extreme level. Can't even describe some of the things that were recorded, but my god, people were horribly insane. The Great Famine brought unrest in peasants, but it also disturbed members of nobility. It's always nice when that happens, right? It's not all of us suffering. Some of these noble purple lords up here are also starving. Cool, we're even. They were set back, and in turn, they gave up the oath of chivalry. Now talk about the Dark Ages. They're like, you know what? No. Number 2, Plague Bear. Busboys, but for bodies. Let's do it. My god, this one's really dark. The hot summer of July 1665, right before London saw that great fire. What to do with all of these poor souls who have been hit by the plague? Now, bodies at this point were literally starting to pile up. So we need a new profession, somebody that deals specifically with these horribly infected bodies. Any volunteers? Show of hands. Yep, we got one. Like a plague bear, for example. There we go, just what we need. A plague bear has your back and your front and all of your infected places. Church wardens would organize burials. This was a normal thing back in the 1600s, but when the plague hit, they had to change things up. If somebody had the plague, well, these plague bears, these brave souls, they would step up. They were the ones responsible for transporting all these bodies far, far away. And then they would bury them, right? Just way over there. Great idea. Honestly, the further the better. Couldn't agree more. A church would house these plagued souls away from society. Now, it sounds sad, but this was the best call, all things considered. So no, you weren't visiting any of your deceased loved ones anytime soon. And finally, number 1, medieval punishment cleaner. This one really sucks. Best for last. Here we go. Back in medieval times, many executions were public. The town would come out watch a hanging or two, and then grab some bread and then head home. They're like, hey, classic Sunday. This was normal back in medieval days. Medieval punishments were like an event, but like modern events, somebody has to stick around and clean the place up. One of the earliest documented executioners goes back to 1202. He was the OG headsman. His name was Nicholas Johann, and their nickname was the Justice. The Justice. Are you kidding me? My palms are already sweating. Are you sure it wasn't the mountain? My God. Afterwards, this position spread through many capitals and large towns of Western Europe, and with them came the execution cleaners. Yeah, just a squeegee and a spray bottle. They're like, hey, which table, boss? Let's do this. Over his 36 years of ruling, King Henry VIII executed roughly 57,000 people. Yeah, welcome to the Middle Ages. Hope you like mopping. You're gonna be doing it a lot. Like a lot.
Number 10, hedgehog. I bet all the things you thought people ate back then, you weren't expecting hedgehog. I know I wasn't. This is medieval times, however, and sometimes food ran short. Sometimes you gotta do things you wouldn't normally do, and that includes eating a poor hedgehog. It starts by ending the life of a porcupine or hedgehog via the neck. Ooh, gross. Singeing all of those protective spine needles, gutting the poor little guy, where it was then boiled so it would naturally unravel because they're always rolled up. Alternatively, you could bake them in clay for that Hannibal experience. Sonic be nimble, Sonic be quick, but not quick enough to avoid our appetites. It's kind of sick. I don't know, I couldn't think of a rhyme there. It's just gross. People eating hedgehogs, man, come on. Number 9, kitty. Honestly, I was a little surprised by this one. No, not because it is a cat. Obviously, in Western society like ours, kitties are pets, and they're just decent animals. I can accept that other cultures and in the past, folks were different. It's what they do. There's nothing wrong with that. However, cats kind of have an interesting history. A lot of times, they're associated with bad luck or misfortune. And not just black cats, but cats in general. Medieval times were weird. So I'm surprised that they would even try and eat one. According to one medieval recipe, it involves removing the head because that's not for eating. Obviously, should have known that. It was thought that the cat brains could make you lose your judgment. I'd argue at that point we'd already lost our judgment, but okay. The next step is simple. You bury it in the ground for a night because that's what you do, and then you boil it in a broth with garlic. I love garlic and broth just as much as the next guy. I don't know if that's the recipe I'd be going for. Oh man, I'm getting sick already. Number 8, beavers. Nice beaver. Thanks, I just had it stuffed. Huh? Naked Gun, anybody? Huh? No? I love Leslie Nielsen movies, what can I say? One day, folks, I promise I'll be there. Speaking of Canadian icons, beavers. It's my national animal, and if you end up on fairgrounds, you can almost bet you will find a vendor selling fried beaver tails. The northern states will know what I'm talking about, but for the southern and western states who for sure eat this but have a different name for it, it's fried dough. It's not actually an actual beaver tail. Beaver tails are delicious, especially with a Nutella spread. Oh, that's my favorite. The hot Nutella, it's beautiful. However, in medieval times, beavers were quite popular. It makes more sense than you think. They were already valuable for their furs, and apparently, well, they were sought after for their round boys. You know what I'm talking about? Cough here. The trend of gotta do what you gotta do is gonna come up a lot on this list. That's just kind of how things go. There's an animal, you're gonna eat it. That's it. Number 7, roasted swan. This one is supposed to be a delicacy. Roasted swan. You just go to the park and see those swans floating in the pond and you think to yourself, yeah, I'd like to roast and eat those birds. Kind of a weird thing to think, but okay, sure. I know swans can be aggressive, but damn, okay. Anyway, more disturbing than daydreaming about eating unusual poultry is what medieval people did to prepare swans. One recipe calls for its guts and vinegar to be used in bread making. I think we'll skip on that one. And another one where the skin is removed, roasted, and then the skin and feathers put back on the bird, so you put it back on the dinner table for like a show and then peel it back off. It's strange. I feel like that's not very sanitary. I feel like the feathers are the dirtiest part. You always have to remove the feathers, don't you, Chris? I don't know. It's weird. Number 6, sheep's business. When you've trimmed all the meat and you're staring at an animal's piece of deal, there's only one thing left to do. Wash it, clean it, stuff it with 10 eggs, milk, fat, and roast it with ginger and cinnamon. Sounds yummy, honestly. I just wish it was a better, cut of meat and not the sheep's meat. Like I said, it's a case of you gotta do what you gotta do. I know today there are some dishes involving the undercarriage of bulls, and I hear it's good, but you can't blame me if I'm a tad skeptical. So that one was all about a sheep's his gabagool, his Wiener von Schnitzelminer.
Number 5, bedchambers. Do I need to say more? Actually, yes. See, while the bedchamber was the place where the deed was done, those lucky servants that were allowed to actually stay in this room with their lords and ladies often slept on the floor, wrapped in blankets and soaking up the heat of the fireplace. The castle itself usually had a cold dampness about it, which sounds lovely. So there were often tapestries hanging on the walls to counteract this. The servants on the floor thing makes me think of when you had like sleepovers and you had to tiptoe through all your friends sleeping on the ground to leave the room. Number 4, gatehouses. Now for a place with the least amount of holes. Actually, it probably had the most. The gatehouse was probably the most fortified structure in the castle. The holes we have here were for the sole purpose of hurling or shooting projectiles. Some were for traps and obstacles. The gatehouse was a house for the main weak spot of the castle, the front gate. And as such, it had to be the most defendable part of said castle. It was also usually the most lavish and ornate part of the castle. If you're inviting Lord Reginald from across the way to your castle, you want him walking through that front door thinking, hey, this guy could absolutely defend against me, but also he has impeccable taste. Number 3, the dungeon. You knew this was gonna be here. Don't pretend to be surprised. Well, guess what? It ain't as common as you might think. And it wasn't always a deep, dank cellar in the bottom of the castle. It actually started off as a prison in the tippy top of the tallest, safest tower. Apparently, keeping people in cells wasn't actually commonplace at first. You'd probably just, But, hey, when they did have dungeons, then yeah, they were pretty grim. They were always put in the coldest, darkest, most moist part of the castle. And they were usually just prisons. Number 2, oubliette. Bouncing off the dungeon is a much smaller dungeon, and hey, another hole. Yep, this one is kind of worse than a latrine though. You see, this is a hole that they would actually put people in. Imagine being put in a hole in the ground, where it was too small for you to actually sit down, with a trapdoor on top, too high to reach. That's an oubliette. The word oubliette is actually from the French word to forget, which is what they'd do. They'd put you in this hole and then forget about you to die. Lovely, right? Number 1, torture rooms. Here we are. Now how many of you weirdos came here for this one? This room is separate from the dungeons usually, not always, but it was at least not very far. Still gotta keep your prisoners cold and dark as you make them squeal for the end, right? Wow, that was dark. This was the room where you'd keep all your favorite tools of the pain trade. Stretched, hung by your ankles, fire, tools of all kind. There were trap doors in some torture rooms too that would lead to dungeons or pools of water. Some torture rooms, like those during the Inquisition, had even thicker walls to keep the screams in. Some of these torture rooms weren't used as often as you think though, as merely having a torture room was enough to get prisoners to give you what you wanted. Alright, can we move on now please? Okay. Since it's my first solo rodeo, I figured I would respond to some comments from our last time together. These are from top 10 dishonorable families in history. First one comes from Kimberly Patton. Hey Adam, welcome to Bumblebee. This is the first video I've seen you in. You are a great addition to the great team. I think we should call you AA. Again, welcome. This is a superb channel and the jokes with you and Ched are awesome. He's right though, you are too cute. AA? Yeah. Haven't heard that one before. Okay, alright, yeah. No, seriously though, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And stop calling me cute, I'm blushing. Maggie Owens says, good stuff guys. I was a little sus about the new guy, but he proved me wrong. Damn straight, don't forget it. Keep watching my videos, they're okay, I guess. Delane Bloom said, lol, you two were great. The two Andrews, or more tacky, the AA twins. You two did a great job! I never laughed so much at the thought of some really awful criminals. Nice job, Big Chet and Andrew. This, by the way, was the first time that I ever saw Andrew. You are a great new addition. Thank you both. If Andrew was the new addition, he would be great. But he's not. It's me, Adam. This is awkward, isn't it? No, but thank you. I really appreciate it.
Slander is number 10. Imagine seeing some random dude in the market square holding his nose and shouting about how he was a liar. Honestly, wasn't weird under the Norman law from 1066 to 1154. If you committed the act of slander, on top of paying damages to those whose reputation you may have affected, you also had to do the holding of the nose. This law was enacted by Pouty, first king of Norman, who had spent his whole life on the throne being called William the Bastard for his parents' unmarried status. In return, he exacted this silly law that required the slanderer to stand in the center of town, as previously described, holding their nose and shouting about their lies. Public humiliation has long since been an effective means of preventing crime, and just about anything. Number 9 is Jenny Craiging it. Edward III of England was so tired of his royal court nobility being heavier set that he made an entire law about it. In 1336, the new law stated obesity made people not able to aid themselves nor their liege lord in times of need. Edward mandated a maximum belt size and also, if you watched part 1, implemented food restrictions, banning more than 2 courses with the exception of holy days. Edward even defined soup as a separate course to prevent people from calling that a sauce or a condiment. This law lasted remarkably until 1856. Its main purpose in the long run had likely become beneficial economically to ensure that England's resources could be employed more effectively in the upcoming war with the French. Still, regardless, he seems like a fat-shaming dude. German purity law is number 8. Beer is Germany's national drink, and that's nothing new. The Germans have been indulging for thousands of years. Typically, beer was produced in groups and always made of pure grain, until the purity laws made by Wilhelm IV in 1516 Bavaria. Germans, and most people of the medieval and Middle Ages, didn't drink water as it was often deeply contaminated. They drank beer. The law imposed was aimed at preventing crops used to make bread from being squandered on brewing, so it stipulates that only water, barley, and hops were allowed to be used as key ingredients for beer production. At first, brewers thought this was ludicrous and unusual to decide, but turns out Wilhelm was actually onto something with this combination. This original law went on to become the core of German beer purity laws that affect German brewing to this day, which makes them the oldest regulations related to food and drink in the world. The only change to it in recent history was the adding of yeast. The Brewers Association of Germany wants the 5-century-old law governing how German beer is made to become part of the UNESCO World Heritage List. It would join the Argentinian tango, Iranian carpet weaving, and French gastronomy, among other famous traditions that are considered unique and worth protecting. Let's talk sumptuary laws with the Spanish garment laws, number 7 in the countdown. Sumptuary laws, which we discussed in part 1, are placed in to control the nobility and their consumption and displays of material goods. In the case of Spain, there are many sumptuary laws in place as early as the Spartan era. In the 13th century, for example, Siena passed a provision reducing the trains on women's dresses, which was a direct effort to curb a purely aristocratic style. In 1356, the city of Florence proclaimed it illegal for women to have buttons on their clothing without a corresponding buttonhole, and also no one other than the king was legally permitted to wear a scarlet rain cape. Also in Florence, it was studied how sumptuary legislation around fashion served as a tool to encourage marriage in a society where excessive extravagance of men providing clothing for the women and their families exasperated the custom of very expensive dowries. If her standards were already up, you had to work harder to pay for her, I guess, and a delay in marriage did mean a dip in population. While there are ample examples of the laws themselves, similar to many other sumptuary laws, there's virtually no record of their enforcement or punishment. Oftentimes this is because nobility themselves violated their own laws that they made for themselves. Without evidence of how exactly these laws were enforced or whether they were enforced at all, it remains extremely difficult to discuss their social impact, the attitude civilians had towards them as well. Did they act accordingly so as not to face legal difficulties or the payment of fines? Who knows? Not us. So on to the next. Refusing knighthood comes in at number 6. This law was put into place in 1233. Why, you may ask? Because simply put, being a knight sucked. If you saw our last video, you may remember hearing about how insanely taxed knights were, but on top of that you had to pay for a ton of mandatory clothes, train incessantly, pay the king for serving him, and don't forget the custom-sized armor. You lose or gain weight, you're gonna have to pay to replace whole pieces. That's on top of the potential of dying in a battle you just don't care for. No, not many people wanted to be a knight. Roger of Dudley refused to attend his own knighting when he learned he'd have to pay for it. In response to his refusal, Henry III on the spot passed a law against refusing the knighthood. He forcefully knighted Dudley and also confiscated his land to boot. Yikes.
Number 5, helmeted chicken. Wind the clock back 10 years ago. I was but a humble freshman in high school. I was green behind the ears. I didn't know what to expect. Sure, people had prepped me for the worst, but I just didn't know what to expect. I got even more nervous when I saw the pretty girls showing up. Gosh, they were so pretty. Someone want to be my girlfriend? But I relaxed. I knew I was okay because at lunchtime I was going to watch my favorite YouTube channel, Epic Mealtime. Besides this one, it's a good channel, you should check it out. We're awesome. They made combinations of food that I didn't even think were possible. I was absorbed into their culture, and who wasn't? Why do I bring the awkward time of 2012 back up? Well, that's because the medieval times had their own version of a turducken. Sort of. While it's not a chicken inside a duck inside a turkey inside a pig covered in bacon like EMT did, it's similar and perhaps off-putting for our veggie fans. Basically, there was a chicken sewn to a pig to look like a knight riding on a horse. And yes, I'm sure the chef washed his hands. Right?
Number 4. Going to the scheduled delifing. Entertainment wasn't as accessible or the same as it is now. In modern times, we pull up our phones, turn on our laptops, sit in front of the TV, and there is all the entertainment we need, from battles to baby drama. But back in the Middle Ages, there wasn't much to do after you were done your work for the day. There were forms of entertainment, music, theater, games, sports, etc. But a favorite would have to be going to see the latest ne'er-do-well lose their head. Public shows of punishment were not just something you went to see when you were bored. Actually, their more important purpose was as a deterrent for anyone who thought of maybe committing a crime. And yeah, that would do the trick. It was also a good way to finalize the trial of a criminal for all those who were affected or who were part of the village. Eventually they became more of a private affair, but not entirely, with the last public delifing in the United States happening in 1936. Let's not bring this one back. No, I'm good. I'll pass.
Number 3, witch trials. Speaking of scheduled delifing, witch trials, or rather, get rid of anyone who's been deemed a witch, which, in case you didn't know, was as simple as this. Right then, the young woman down the lane is smarter than her boys in the school. Right then, folks, pitchforks and torches it is. Unfortunately, for a lot of women at the time, it was tough. When has it not been, right ladies? While some men were declared witches too, this was a tool really for people with power to get rid of those who dare oppose them. There's too many royals to mention who took part in this, however, one stands out as Bloody Queen Mary. Names like this were not given for no reason. She was known for sending witches and heretics alike to the stake to be cooked.
Number 2, outlaw. In movies and TV, characters named as outlaws, specifically in the Wild West sense, are seen as cool guys, outsiders, and wanderers with an air of mystery and possibly power. Trust me when I say it was not what you wanted to be, especially in the medieval times. If you were declared an outlaw in the Middle Ages, you lost all rights, possessions, and any kind of protection being part of society would give you, including people getting in trouble for ending your stay on this plane of existence. You are forced to fend for yourself with nothing to your name, and in a world rife with disease, wars, bandits, and very little readily available food or water, things get harsh quick. If you didn't have a buddy to turn to for help, who you knew for a fact would not literally stab you in the back, then you were pretty screwed. Luckily, I have Andrew. Right?
Yeah! Number 1, ladies. Okay, so let's say you're married. Husband tends the crops. You as the wife take care of the home. This isn't a statement about the patriarchy. I'm just saying taking care of the home is just as important back then. Seriously, it is. Well, your husband comes in from tending the fields one night with a fever. Uh-oh, he's fallen ill, and now he's perished. Now you're left alone with no income and a society that's probably not okay with you working. So that means it's time to pull up your pants. Well, actually pull them down, as in a scenario like this, it would be time to work that street corner, and a lot of women did do that. The same way Adam works on building Legos in his dungeon. I joke. But as they say, it's the oldest profession in the book, and folks, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Tradition or not.
Alright, let's get going with how you're weird for drinking water. Because it's actually not true that water wasn't drinkable, just that people tended to get sick from drinking still water and they knew it. And they knew boiling said still water would make it drinkable, the way that spring water and natural well water were. People prefer to drink cold water rather than hot, and there was the paranoia that if the water cooled back down, it would become unsafe to drink again. So an alternative was to make something out of it if you don't want to drink hot water all season long. Thus, beer. The end product of the boiled barley mix would endure storage for weeks or months, its taste would improve with time, and it was better than drinking steamy hot water all day. 2 batches would be produced from the same mash. The first was a full strength beer, the second was lower in alcohol, and that was consumed more throughout the day while working or when you're just thirsty. So yes, while water was available, beer still was the bev of choice. People thought that you were either a nutcase or just highly devout religious if water was your go-to. One account by the Gallo-Roman Roman historian Saint Gregory mentions a boy so religious he primarily drank water. Ooh, shocking. Our next title is all about titles, because the medieval, middle, whatever ages were all about titles more so than any other time in European history. Think about it, I mean, they literally called the system feudalism because of the constant feuding between higher titles. Kings delegated power among their trusted subordinates. So dukes are under kings and they rule duchies, counts are under them and they rule counties, the clergy's under them and they rule religious institutions, the mayors are under them and they rule cities, and then the aldermen are under those guys and they rule the villages. These rulers and other wealthy landowners make up the nobility. Below the nobility are the typical citizens, and below them are the serfs, the ones who are hard laborers indebted to nobles. Nowadays you can come from a small slum town and work your way up to Hollywood fame just using an iPhone and a ring light. Back then, if you were alderman rank or below, there is not much hope for you. You're locked into your social stature for life. A lot of us are probably feeling cocky, feeling like that's survivable. You forget the entitlement you have in your day-to-day lives. Because living back then, everything is a debt. You may be wondering, Teresa, how is that any different from now? Society's crumbling, inflation has destroyed the young generations. Well, let me tell you how status and debt in medieval times was just as much, if not more, of a prison than nowadays digital credit system. So, now that you understand the system of titles, back to the average Joe, the peasant. Chances are you're a farmer, but you don't have any tools and you don't own the land either. The nobles have both the tools and the land. In order to actually farm, you gotta go to your local noble and he gives you the land and tools. In exchange, you give him a portion of your crops. Usually this is about 50 to 75% of what you grow. So if you grow about an acre of crops, you have just enough to feed yourself and your family and pay the noble. Now if you choose this life, which you will if you want to survive, you're going to miss a couple of payments to said noble, putting you in debt to him, thus a serf. Meanwhile, your local duke wants to raise an army to conquer the neighboring duke's land. He has to get the approval of the counts under him, and the counts have to get the approval of the landowners. This is because, like you, the landowners don't actually own the land. Their duke does. The duke doesn't own the land either. The king does. The landowner sends some of the crops he takes from you to the duke already, but now he has another responsibility for him. He has to raise his army. Can you guess where this army comes from? That's right, it's you. Welcome to paying a debt with your life. But don't worry, being in battle isn't all bad. Look at why they invented chivalry. In 21st century, the word chivalry evokes a kind of old-fashioned male respect for women. But in early Middle Ages, church councils were literally praying to be delivered from knights. And by the late 11th century, early 12th, it was decided they straight up needed laws to govern these guys. Knights were essentially hired thugs dressed in tin cans on horses and were commanded by warlords after all. How great do you expect them to be? They were rewarded with land or the license to plunder the villages Game of Thrones style, looting, forcing themselves on women, killing the innocent, burning it down. But a lot of the time they didn't wait for that to be rewarded. Knights were known to terrorize villages and towns they came across as if they were bandits. For example, in 1379, Sir John Arundel rode to a convent and asked the nuns to put him up for a few nights. After they agreed, he and his armed men looted the nunnery, stormed a nearby church, stole a newly married bride, forced themselves upon her, kidnapped the nuns, take them out to sea, and throw everybody overboard. At a time where routine night violence and with massive citizen casualties were happening, chivalry was an effort to set ground rules for knightly behavior. While these rules sometimes dictated generous treatment of the less fortunate, they were focused mainly on protecting the interests of the elite. Hope you're one of those, otherwise you might die because a sociopath on a horse is bored. And now for the vast nothingness. There was nobody for miles. From childhood as far as your eyes can see outside of your house, other houses, and about 200 people, there is nothing. Just nothing. You lived and died seeing the same thing every day with only a few excuses to travel out into the world. In 1086, there were 1 million people living in all of England, compared with the 53 million today. By the 1300s, this had climbed to 4 mil, but the Black Death wiped out about 1.5 mil of those people between 1348 and 1350, meaning many villages were completely decimated or just abandoned. Traveling parties in medieval Europe were not exactly rolling in options for transportation means when it came time to travel. Horses, carts, human feet, and that last one was by far the most common. There were a lot of reasons why even the average peasant may travel. In England between 600 AD and 1485, these included going to mass, because early villages didn't really have their own churches, or attendance at the local court, which was compulsory for all free men once a month, payments of taxes to the royal royal manor 4 times a year. But just short of going to the neighboring big town, most never really left their homes or their home community. Women especially, they weren't seen to have much purpose outside of their front door.
Number 5. Castles. Besides a knight in shining armor, what's the first thing you think of when you think of medieval times? Castles! Yeah, obviously. Yes, I'm talking about castles, but bear with me here, just hear me out. Okay, so when we were kids, we all wanted to live in a huge mansion, right? I mean, who doesn't? I wouldn't though, because, well, it would be a pain in the neck to clean. As you grow up, you start thinking about weird things like that. It would be really difficult to clean. But it's a common wish nonetheless. Well, castles basically are medieval mansions, except with a little twist. These castles are also designed with military strategy in mind. So imagine, if you will, you have a world where your parents have a mansion, but they had to add guard towers and an armory and a battalion of soldiers just in case the next kingdom over gets a little too frisky. The positioning of the castle was also very important too, some built by the coast, on top of hills, and even some inside of mountains, all in the name of protection. To me, that's like some Purge level reality where wealthy homes have to be built with defenses in mind. It's kind of messed up.
Number 4. Fair. Punishments for crime in the Middle Ages were different from they are today. Capital punishment happens now still, like it did then, but we don't really put people into exile so much anymore. Unless you count the prison system, but that's another conversation altogether. Back in medieval Ireland though, someone who de-lifed someone else and was judged to be guilty was given to the deceased's family as their unwilling servant. That is, if they failed to pay the oodles of money required to buy their freedom. As we know, people who were forced into manual labor were not treated too nicely, and they pretty much had no rights at all, being seen as property more than an individual. This means that the family that now owns said person could do whatever they wanted with them. Their life was basically forfeit. Now, if the person who ended the life of one of your beloved family members was now given to you to do whatever you wanted with them, what would you do? Yes, me too. Probably. It seems fair to me. Leave the punishment to those who are most affected by the crime.
Number 3, Shark Week. Aunt Flo. She shows up sometimes during those delightful few days that ladies have. I hear you, I know. I'm not a lady, I don't know why I said that. I'm just trying to relate to the audience. But have you ever wondered how things were dealt with before the modern world of feminine hygiene products? Today, you got options, but back then, well, they didn't really exist. Ladies had to come up with methods and honestly, the beginnings of what the products would eventually evolve into. A lot of times it was extra cloth or rags were used, perhaps where the expression on the rag may have come from. Now, I have no issue talking about this because it's natural, it's a part of life. I'm a grown-up, dude. The tradition of this point is in the tradition of hiding it or being ashamed. That's what started in medieval times too, unfortunately. And sadly, it's carried over to today just a little bit. Some even consider cramps to be a punishment for Eve's original sin back then, which is just so stupid. Things have gotten a little better, but I think you can all agree with me, ladies. It's time for everyone else to grow up a little bit.
Number 2, trick or treat, it's Christmas. What? Sorry. In Northern Europe and Scandinavian countries, Yule time meant adopting the tradition we are familiar with from modern Halloween. Dressing up like your favorite spooky characters. Or what it is now, trying to one-up your friends with the hottest insert occupation here costume you can. They didn't dress up as sexy cats or nurses though. But from the day of Christmas to the 12th night, young men would dress up according to, quote unquote, the old fashion of the devil, and go around in the night scaring people in the streets. These young spunky lads would go about as ghosts, trolls, or other strange creatures, and in the 16th and 17th century, some men would even dress as the Yule goat, terrifying children and coming into people's houses demanding cake or cheese, then pleasantly thanking them if he received something, or whacking them with a stick if he didn't. Then the goat would just hop on out of there like this.
That was cute, dude. Thanks, man. Number 1, Lord's Right. This one is just so messed up. Okay, so back in medieval times, imagine if you will that you've just been married to a beautiful woman. Just finished walking down the aisle when the local lord of the land makes a surprise appearance at your wedding. At first you bow and welcome his lordship. That's when he grabs your blushing bride-to-be and looks at you with the snobbiest look a royal could and says, "Sorry bud, Lord's right, gotta take her for a test drive," to make sure everything's great. Yes, that's right, there was a law, or a code if you will, that allowed lords to entertain wives for a few hours. Or like a few seconds. You must also imagine this is a time when speaking out against lords for doing so would not have bode well for you or your wife, so let's just go along with the plan.
Number 10, medieval aliens? With a lot of the tales from medieval times, it is hard to separate sometimes truth from myth. Many of these stories are actually hard to back up that we have from those days, even when they are true. I mean, they happened so long ago, it's not always easy to find substantial evidence which has survived to the modern age. And then there is the fact that a lot of things that happen in the medieval ages sound kind of ridiculous by today's standards. But this one is really something else. Apparently, there were 2 children who were found by a village who had green skin and spoke a language that was unrecognized by those that found them. The boy sadly did not survive, but the girl did. And when she grew up, she explained that she and her brother had come from a place that was very green and had gotten lost while tending their father's cattle, coming to Woolpit, the village where they were, via a cave. Her skin with time actually lost its green hue apparently, but it's never been determined where these children actually came from geographically, or if they even really existed, if this story is actually true or it's meant to be a folktale. Either way, it's a very strange story, even if we consider it a folktale. Like, what's that supposed to be about? Why was their skin green? And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Bumblebee, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 9. Swimming test. I mean, witch trials in general were just a weird time, and one of the trials that was considered the weirdest by far in terms of tests, that is, not like actual trials themselves, cases, would have had to be the swimming test. Oftentimes those being tested were bound first and then basically dunked or tossed into the water after of course having been stripped down to their skivvies. Of course, being that they were bound and adding in the fact that swimming wasn't, commonly something you would have learned back then unless you were someone who lived or worked on a ship, there were accidental deaths that happened in regards to this test. The other super ridiculous part is we didn't really fully understand just yet how buoyant humans were, because we didn't know that human bodies were actually mainly made up of water. So they actually believed that if you floated, you were a witch, and it was a sign of the water basically rejecting you because you were never truly baptized, having rejected the sacrament of baptism because, you're a witch, so you serve Satan. I have to imagine that unless you were flailing aimlessly and drowning spectacularly, that most of those who were dunked were believed to be witches, and then even if you were drowning spectacularly, you might have not made it. Although, to be clear, they didn't usually tie a rope to people so they could pull them back up if that happened. However, I'm sure that didn't always work. This whole thing was pretty ridiculous though, because human bodies are naturally buoyant and don't really sink. It's not witchcraft. That's just science, baby. Number 8. Clown shoes. For some reason, people were really into long shoes back in the day. Really long toes. The longer your shoes were, apparently the more refined you were considered to be. Look at these very long-toed shoes. I can't even walk in these. So hence why people tried to get the longest shoes around to wear. Apparently the shoes were so long at one point that they actually had to be reinforced with whalebone. I don't know about you, but I've worn long pointed toed shoes before, once or twice, and just even having a toe that is honestly like an inch or 2 longer than, what I would normally be wearing makes it horrifyingly hard to walk around in. I was scuffing my toes left, right, and center. But I guess if you were really wealthy back in the day, you ideally wouldn't have to walk at all. So would this be a problem? I don't know. I would hopefully have someone carrying me around, I guess, or put me on a carriage or something. Number 7. Prayer test. I personally think I would fail this test really hard, even being a good public speaker and even someone that reads avidly. Basically, the prayer test was used to figure out if you were a witch by checking to see if you could read the Bible. This was also usually something that was done publicly, so if you were nervous, scared, or worried about your trial, or just if you struggled to read, like so many did back then and some still do today, you were in trouble. The idea was that witches would not be able to read the holy words because they were witches, so they'd be like, I can't read that, God is taking away my power. That's why this existed. While like many trials it was used as proof of someone being a witch, on the other hand, if you passed this test with flying colors, it also didn't mean that you were innocent, so you're not off the hook yet. So yeah, I guess classic witch trials, am I right? Classic tests. Oh, you pass with flying colors? Well, you could still be a witch. We don't know about that. We gotta do more tests. Do the pricking test. Let's do this test. Dunk them in the water. Number 6, the dancing plague. To this day, people still don't know what caused the dancing plague to happen, which is pretty scary and strange. We only know that it did happen in 1518 and potentially a few other times earlier on throughout the medieval ages. What happened? Well, people started to spontaneously dance and then tragically spontaneously die. Some of them died from heart attacks, some dropped dead from exhaustion, being unable to stop dancing, but what we don't really know even to this day is why. There are a few leading theories though. One is food poisoning. I gotta say, this one sounds the most likely to me. Not just any kind of food poisoning are we talking about here. We are talking about a fungal type of food poisoning that actually could have resulted in people getting dosed involuntarily with a hallucinogenic. Another theory is mass hysteria, and another still, although one that I think is the most odd and honestly unlikely, is that people were basically forced to dance because of religious reasons. It sounds unlikely to me, however there are cases of this happening, so maybe it's not that unlikely. Sometimes people were apparently forced to dance non-stop as punishment for their sins. Honestly, a pretty exhausting and terrible punishment if you ask me. I mean, fun to start, we all like to dance to start, but you know, when you have to dance for a whole year or something, that would quickly become the worst thing ever, I imagine. And of course, you might not survive that punishment, because dancing, it exhausts you.
Number 5, animal court. Oh, did you think the courtroom was a place only for members of the human species? Au contraire. In fact, all kinds of members of the animal kingdom, from insects to dolphins, would stand trial if they were believed to be guilty of crimes. Some animals were executed, some received strongly worded letters, and some were even proven not guilty. A rooster was once given the verdict of guilty for laying eggs. Truly the most unnatural of crimes. Pigs were usually the ones who got the most amount of court time, with one account even having a pig dressed in a waistcoat, gloves, pants, and a human mask to meet his end. I wonder if these animals were judged by a jury of their peers.
Number 4, bloodletting. Look, we all know that a lot of men in their mid-40s treat their bodies like a rusted out Chevy Tahoe. I'm one and the same. Yeah, it needs a lot of work, but Dad got an oil change, so that makes it all better. This was common back in medieval times. A simple fix, or a one fix fits all for every health issue, was of course bloodletting. The old drain you of your precious life juice so you can get a detox, bro. Look, at first glance, yeah, it makes sense. If my Chevy runs a wee bit better after an oil change, then why not? It makes sense. Well, the truth is, there really isn't any new blood going in, so it's not so much as an oil change as it is so much just draining you of your energy, bro. Did it really work? Not really. Arguably, it made things worse. This was also a treatment to make your skin pale, and as my previous point with the ladies, that was also seen as beautiful, so remember that. Go to blood clinic.
Please don't drain your blood to look prettier. Number 3, Feast of Fools. Before the church took the fun of going overboard out of pretty much everything, every January 1st in France, the whole social hierarchy got topsy-turvy with the Feast of Fools. No, this was not a festival promoting fool-related cannibalism. Instead, the highest respected religious officials swapped with the lowest, and serving maids became masters, with a king of misrule being crowned. The event was meant to display the biblical phrase, "God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise," which is a creative excuse for parades, comic performances, costumes, cross-dressing, song, and naturally, way too much drinking. But like I said, thanks to the rowdy merrymaking and obscenities, the church was forced to ban it. Sad.
Number 2, funeral rites. Medieval times, people were dropping like flies, just how things went. So, when it was time to deliver folks to their final resting place, some traditions were in order. For those that couldn't shake the Black Plague, they were put into big holes with the rest of the poor devils who couldn't also. Loved ones were taken care of with, well, great care and respect, and others, well, they had modifications made to their graves. Like for instance, if you were suspected of being a vampire, well, you'd be buried with a giant boulder on top of you, just in case, you don't know. Maybe you decide to wake up and come back to town for a midnight snack. Gotta be careful. Some were buried without heads, the list goes on. All I can say is keep your garlic close, your wooden stakes, and just always wash your hands, especially when handling the recently deceased. You gotta get...
Number 1, duke it out. Couples in medieval Germany had an interesting way of figuring out their differences. Rather than just arguing like any normal couple, they took it to the octagon. Honestly, yeah, let's bring it back. Trial by single combat was a popular way to solve disagreements, and when man and wife were fighting, they had some great rules that had to be implemented. As one example, the husband had to stand in a hole with a hand behind his back while his wife got to run around with a sack filled with rocks. Seems a bit unfair, but hey, to each their own. I just imagine every time I have an argument with a girlfriend, and right in the middle of it, we just stop like, okay, I've had enough. We're settling this with our fisticuffs. Consult the marital duel rulebook and have at thee, foul beast. Number 10. Saving your pee-pee. Back in the day, whole families, monasteries, and public meeting places would collect the pee-pee deposited in chamber pots throughout the day. Yummy! They would take the amassed forbidden lemonade and either donate it, or if they were feeling enterprising, they could sell the wee-wee to the town tanner or fuller. You see, the warm yellow liquid was used for the process of dyeing textiles and in the tanning of hides. Oh, and it was also used for cleaning clothes. Screw the smell of Tide and bounce dryer sheets, I'll take the smell of wetting the bed and Grandpa's favorite chair, thank you very much. Urine was also used by physicians at the time to tell the health of their patients. I do this too. You know when it's clear and you feel like you're the most hydrated guy around? It's nice. I definitely don't taste it like the physicians back then though, or Saul Goodman in season 5 of Better Call Saul. I'll stick with apple juice for my favorite yellowish drink, thanks.
Number 9, belladonna, or commonly known as deadly nightshade. Now, what would our medieval ancestors be doing with such a lethal ingredient? Well, truth be told, it had a few uses. One of the more strange was for beauty. Belladonna had this strange effect on the pupils. The consumption of belladonna through eye drops, or a liquid, would result in dilated pupils, which for a long time in Europe was considered to be very beautiful. At least, it was considered beautiful. I don't know if that really is. The trouble, well, it's poison. It's like if you were complimenting me on my summer-ready body. Except I told you my secret was drinking Drano. To my surprise, however, this is an ingredient you can find today in certain medicines combined with other ingredients. In small doses, it makes it not harmful. I thought it would be fun to talk about all the side effects as fast as I can. Dry mouth, dry skin, inability to sweat, muscle spasms, blurred vision, enlarged pupils, hallucinations, inability to urinate, talk to Adam, convulsions, seizures, coma, acid reflux, fever, rapid heartbeat, gastrointestinal infection, high blood pressure, constipation, and more urination problems. Adam's the guy you need to talk to for that.
Number 8. Barber for a brain transplant. No, not actually. I don't think they even knew what a brain transplant was, let alone how to perform one. But in the Middle Ages, barbers were not just responsible for cutting your hair and giving monks that lovely bald thing going on top. No, they were also responsible for tending to the wounded after doing battle, taking care of the sick, and all the other medical services that the actual physicians were too good for. It's actually the reason we see those red and white spinning signs outside barbers, because it's symbolic of the bloody rags they would use to show that they could do the bloodletting required of monks in the Middle Ages. These barbers even formed a guild in the 13th century, lasting all the way up to the 18th century. Barbers are talented individuals. No one can cut my hair the way Tony does.
Number 7, jesters. If you were to peer your nightshade eyes into a royal court, it might take a second because that stuff ain't good for you, you'll find a few things. First and foremost, you will see a king and his throne, the man who rules it all. Next to him would be a most beautiful queen, the woman who has it all. Hiding in the room upstairs are his mistresses. That's just how it goes. Loyal knights, advisors, cooks, everyone's here, as Mr. Sakurai would say, except for one missing person. Who? Me and Adam, the jesters. Oh, hi. Sorry. The jesters, the jokers. Yes, no royal court is the same without the jester. The jester's job was to just laugh. He's a ye olde comedian. Now, it might seem like it sucks, especially because, well, they wore strange attire and that hat was supposed to resemble that of an ass's ear or a donkey's ear, depending on what you want to say. But the jester possesses a unique power. No, not the power to fart on command, that's my power. The power to speak freely, or at least more freely than most. This was a time when speaking out against the king could lose your head. The jester could speak about the kings this way because, well, everything he said was taken as a joke. Some advice I think we could all take today.
Number 6. Everybody drinking. I recently went to go pick up some beers, and I went up to the cashier and I got my debit card out and prepped my ID. The cashier asked me, "How do you want to pay?" And I handed him my ID, being so accustomed to being confused for a prepubescent younger lad. He looked at me confused and said, Nah, you're good, bro. And boom, embarrassment. This interaction would never take place back in the medieval times because literally everyone was able to drink. It was usually the case to drink beer or wine in place of clean water. Now they did have clean water before you all jumped on me in the comments, but for when it wasn't on hand, beer and wine was accepted in its place. It was a common part of the medieval diet. I think they convinced themselves of this in the same way I tell myself it's okay to have another one. Well, it's made of grains with water, so that means it's healthy, right? Red wine is good for my heart, so drinking it right out of the bottle is okay, right? No, probably not.
Number 5, pole vaulting. The day pole vaulting was born was December 25th, 1521. It was a Christmas miracle, some would say. A laborer named Robert Baker, he was heading home from the church after a Christmas gathering. Severe floods interrupted his normal commute home, classic medieval flash floods. So Robert Baker, the quick thinker that he is, he grabbed a tall pole and he just vaulted his way over this new stream that had appeared. And then he continued home. He just carried the stick home and he was like, what have I done? What have I invented? Now at Bumblebee, we don't recommend this as a commute. Don't pole vault over things in general, unless you're a professional, don't do that. Because later on, when attempting that same stunt, Baker's pole snapped mid-leap and he ended up drowning. Yeah, the poor guy bridged to Terabithia himself. You don't want anything to happen like that. That's really bad. Again, in 1540, a similar case. Somebody tried to leap over a pond, but the pole wasn't strong enough and it broke and they drowned. Do you pole vault? If so, comment down below how scary it is to learn, because I'm interested. I don't know. Number 4, falling bacon. If they ever made a Final Destination movie that takes place in medieval times, that'd be an odd pitch. This would be the opening scene, for sure. This is crazy. Not sure how true this is, but if so, oh boy, my palms are sweating. It was February 12th, 1543, and Elizabeth Brown was working as a servant in the household of a man named Hugh Talmash. Now this was over in Huntingdon. Things were going swimmingly, I guess, until a tragic accident occurred. Elizabeth was the victim of a freak accident while sitting by the kitchen fire. A massive unsliced chunk of bacon was suspended in the chimney above her to smoke over time, and that day the rope decided to just go, and then said bacon ended up crushing her. Now, if you're smoking meats, don't put it above or near you. That's a bizarre way to smoke meat. And also, if you're smoking meat, must be nice. That's a crazy charcuterie board. Number 3, outhouse troubles. This next one really stinks. My gosh. If you're eating food right now watching this, maybe skip to number 2. I won't take it personally. Here we go. On June 2nd, 1523, a Cambridge baker named George Duncan went out to his back garden to use the medieval outhouse, aka the cesspit. Now today they're built a little differently, but back in the day it was a massive hole with a wooden rim. It wasn't pretty, it didn't smell great, it was horrible, it made you sick. Now Duncan, the poor lad, rumor has it, he was a little intoxicated, and Duncan, while doing his business, fell into said cesspit, leading him to suffocate to death in the worst way imaginable. Now it sounds like a crazy way to go in medieval times, but it can happen today as well. Because in 2014, 2 people lost their lives trying to recover a cell phone that fell into a porta potty. Yeah, imagine that. Losing consciousness in feces is a dangerous place to do it. That's very horrible. That's a horrible way to go out. That's the worst way to go, I think. That's the worst. Number 2, clocks. Yeah, if you think a piano falling on your head is insane odds, now imagine a clock. Welcome to the medieval times. The 16th century saw the beginning of clockmaking, and early on these things, they were units. They were massive. Great-grandfather clocks, these early mechanical pieces, they were made of metal and were chock full of machinery. Weight equals danger, and in 1513, a man named John Townsend was holding an iron clock, very proud, when all of a sudden it slipped from his hand and it hit the young man right next to him. William Brett. It hit him right in the forehead, and the next day Brett died of his injuries. Guy died because he got hit with a clock. What a way to go. And finally, number 1, horse racing. I think it's general knowledge at this point, but standing near a racehorse equals not a good idea. Right, you heard it here first on Bumblebee. January 16th, 1540, 2 riders named Henry Headlam and Brian Newton, they were racing back and forth along a wall in a garden right outside of London. Casual medieval time stuff, just racing horses. Now, Newton's horse was going quite fast, and Newton didn't realize that he was approaching an elm tree. Now, his head hit a branch from the tree, and he broke his neck and died the next day. Now, right after this first tragic death, racing was seen as a danger to spectators and riders. More than fair. Riding a live animal at top speed, yeah, that's obviously a little bit dangerous, I would assume. But then in 1534, Jane Jonies was just watching, not even riding, she was watching horse racing, and then out of nowhere, a horse trampled her. Yeah, 4 days later, her injuries got the best of her. So if you're watching any live horse racing this afternoon, I don't know, have some distance maybe. Move up a couple of seats in the stands. Horse racing is big in Ontario for some reason. I don't know, we have like one big one, constantly busy.
Alright, so you guys know my drill, so let's start off with the information most people may know a little bit more about already, such as dowries, which is a nice way for fathers to say, I will literally pay your family to get this chick out of my house. The arrangement of marriage was done by the bride and groom's parents. Royal or noblemen were sometimes able to choose their bride, but marriage back then was not based on love for the nobility. They were political arrangements. Husbands and wives were generally strangers until they first met, and if love was ever involved, it came after the couple had been married. But even if it didn't, most just sort of settled into a form of friendship or companionship, or just living with each other. The arrangement of marriage was based on monetary worth. Noble girls equal fatter stacks. Meanwhile, peasant dowries didn't really happen often, and when they did, they were paid in utilitarian means. The family of a girl who was to be married would give a dowry to the family of the boy she was to marry. After the marriage was arranged, the wedding notice was posted up on the doors of the church, and the notice was put up to ensure that there were no grounds for prohibiting the marriage by stating who was to be married and if anyone knew any reasons why they could not. But more on that in a little bit. Now, as mentioned, peasants were able to marry for love, but why make that choice? There was no marital benefits back then, because it's marriage or burn in damnation. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church essentially presented women with two life options in order to escape the sin of Eve. You could become celibate, which ultimately was the preferred choice, or to become married and mothers. You don't bathe, there's feces everywhere, there's the plague, and a man could just kill you tomorrow for rejecting him, and you want to add kids to that equation? When there's no medicine either? Pass. Hard pass. Nunneries were literal havens for these single women, because sure, you could be celibate and still live in town being a spinner or whatever, but again, you run the risk of some dude just jumping you and the courts blaming you for it and then doing something whack like cutting your nose off for it. Nunneries were female only. They kept things clean and locked up, so women could just try and have an ounce of peace in an era where existence was just to breed or feel bad about yourself. According to Halston C.S., once a girl was physically ready to consummate, aka she met Aunt Flo, she was ready for marriage. However, since puberty came earlier for females than males, they could marry at a younger age. So, for peasants who were genuinely interested in marriage out of love, something that could only be done consensually on both sides, they were eligible once they'd hit their respective puberties, and were able to wed. No parental consent required, which is the next on the list. As people lived short lives in the Middle Age period, parents of nobility often made arrangements early on, and a few months old baby could be betrothed to another few month old baby, and then raised in their respective royal nurseries until they hit that jolly old consummation age in their teens. Think Sleeping Beauty being promised to the prince in the Disney movie. Peasants and commoners, however, were able to marry as they wished, and parental consent wasn't even required. It was like this for centuries. But there's always those folks who didn't like when two separate religions mixed, and there's always those who tried to take advantage of the easy I do policy. So good things never last, and it didn't. When this law finally changed in England in the 18th century, the old rules still applied in Scotland, making towns just over the border such as Gretna Green a destination for English couples defying their family and wanting to marry without their consent. A brief personal story for you guys. So my mother is a traveler and decided to visit the famous Gretna Green town and wedding site, where the tradition of Gretna Green marriages still lives today. My mother was taking photos and reading history plaques when she got taken aside by her tour guide. A couple whose family wasn't supportive of their relationship, just like the couples of the past, had shown up and decided to marry spontaneously in the traditional way. They had chosen Gretna Green for its historical significance to their unsupported love, and they needed two witnesses. The tour guide could act as one witness, but they needed a second. So my mother stood as a witness for a young couple who had just traveled to the border to marry at Gretna Green alone, experiencing the same pilgrimage thousands of couples had done in history. So on the topic of witnesses, how did that get started? Up next is witness schmitness. In the Middle Ages, the household was headed by a husband, and his wife was the center of the family life and economic productivity. As John Wells said in 1486, more things are necessary for a household than 4 naked thighs. And he used this retort upon hearing that his alleged betrothed, Alice Billingham, had publicly declared they were married. Instead of saying it straight, John was chastising Alice for suggesting they could legitimize their romantic relationship without the necessary social status and financial stability, not just intercourse. Alice, however, goes, nah, bro, I got the receipts, which were her witnesses to the fact that John had asked her to be be his wife on the Feast of St. Valentine's that same year, which historically, yes, has always been a romance hallmark holiday, asking her for her hand so that she could be his Valentine forever. These two contrasting stories, however, give us a peephole into the tension between the expectation of love versus intercourse, and then the making of a good and economically fortuitous marriage in the Middle Ages. Alice says, "You proposed to me with love, therefore that is our marriage basis." John says, "I may have said I loved you, but I won't make a wife out of a..." Well, you get it. So, while God was the ultimate witness, that's why couples could just say stuff like, "Be mine forever" and become legally married. It's nice and all, but it was highly recommended to have witnesses to avoid uncertainty like the Alice and John situation. Because they didn't just sign your wedding doc back then, they stopped your husband from wandering off. I've done a lot of talk on the ins and outs of marriage, but how about kiss to be kissed, the medieval wedding ceremony itself? So, there was some errands to run leading up to the big day. First of all, long before the actual wedding, banns were called, which were literally 3 Sundays leading up. Someone stands outside the church and hollers that your wedding day is coming up. It's done so that people can come find out about the celebration and come along to the wedding. But also, those who had objections had the opportunity to voice them. They also put up signs on the church door with information, so if you're out just buying turnips one day and saw your husband's name and face on a poster, you could go up to the medieval lost and found and say, "Hey, yo, this one's mine. Wedding's off." A wedding ceremony could not be held on a Catholic holiday or on Sundays. A couple could not be married during a time of fasting. They can't be married by someone who had killed someone else. So make sure you got all those things written down to avoid. When weddings started to occur at churches, they were done at the front doors. Nobles married with big parades and elaborate garbs, while peasants sort of kicked it in whatever they had. The couple would exchange vows, usually some Jesus-y stuff, and the priests asked one last time if anybody's got any beef with these two getting hitched. After that, the groom presented his bride with the wedding ring, blessed by the priest, and the ring was placed on each finger of the bride before landing on the ring finger, and amen, the ring stays there. Then the procession goes into the church, a special mass began, and people prayed for the couple and their future offspring. After the mass, the priest kissed the groom on both cheeks, and finally, the groom would kiss the bride. Number 5 is the Russian beard tax. Alright, so this technically was just outside the realm of medieval times and into middle times, but in 1698, Russian Emperor Peter the Great placed a tax on beards, hoping to force men to adopt the clean-shaven look that was common in Western Europe. Peter's goal was to shift Russia to an Eurocentric visual. His return from a 2-year escapade in Europe had him changing up the fashion trends as well, replacing their long, familiar Russian overcoats with French or Hungarian-style jackets. They were shorter in length. It meant anyone walking the streets in an old-fashioned robe was liable to have it cut short by Peter's designated fashion inspectors. The same inspectors would approach any bearded man they saw, requesting to see his beard token, a silver coin with a leafed edge, and in the center, a mustache, nose, and beard. This token was given to men who had paid their legally mandated beard tax for the year. No token provided when asked. Doesn't matter if you forgot it at home. The inspectors would cut your beard off on the spot or simply rip it out of your face. The Russian Orthodox Church, which hated Peter the Great, saw this as a downright scandal, as their teachings considered uncut facial hair a reflection of piety, seeing as man was created in the image of God, which included a beard. To shave it was a grave sin, but the church never really could stop Peter or his wily goals. This beard tax remained in place until 1772. Nowadays, these beard tokens are actually extremely rare collectibles, selling for as much as $10,000 in auctions today. Number 4 tells you don't mess with royal animals. Whether it's eating them, hunting them, or breeding them, the royals had some rules for their medieval animals. First up is how in 1332 a statute passed established the king shall have throughout the realm whales and great sturgeons taken in the sea or elsewhere within the realm. In normal English terms, what they're saying is any whales or sturgeons that were caught or washed up on crown-ruled soil, it had to first be offered to royalty before being pilfered. This law is actually still in place today, but rarely ever actualized on. However, in 2004, a fun Welsh fisherman diligently complied with the law by offering a sturgeon he had caught to the queen herself. She politely declined the offer. Interestingly enough, the provisions of this statute are expressly protected from repeal by the Wild Creatures and Forest Laws Act of 1971, as it ensures hunting these animals is minimized. Wanna offend a royal? No? Pay attention to your dog, as it's an offense to let your dog mate with any dog belonging to a royal family member. Queen Elizabeth II's corgis of modern day are included, as this law is also still valid now. There were animal laws that weren't just for royals, however. A law said that keeping a pigsty in front of your home was illegal unless it was well hidden. You also weren't allowed to be in charge or ride horses and cows if you were intoxicated, the first drunk driving regulations. And as you may know, even animals could face the judge and jury in animal court for their crimes. Number 3, we discuss how excessive food consumption led to restrictive laws on how food and drink were to be made, sold, and consumed. This is a great example of sumptuary laws from the point 10, where the royalty is irritated by blurring lines between them and the bourgeoisie. In 1309, Edward II criticized the outrageous and excessive multitude of meats and dishes that the nobles were eating, emulating the lifestyle of their superiors. So Edward III, in 1336, enacts a law that would have made his daddy proud. No man of whatever rank he shall be served a meal with more than 2 courses, except for certain festivals such as Christmas, on which 3 courses were allowed. Edward III said that many mischiefs caused by the many sorts of costly meats which people in this realm had used was the reason for this decision. But seeing as commoners were practically starving to death at the time, it's obvious where this law was pointed. These laws may or may not have influenced the behavior, but there was no real evidence of any actual enforcement of them. So despite this, the statute wasn't repealed until 1856, but there was no proof of it being used. Scold, and no, not what your mom does when you don't clean your room, is number 2. The word scold was used as a legal term for women who disturbed their peers or husbands' peace with quarreling, gossiping, slander, brawling, or even just talking too much. Imagine he left his socks on the floor again, you tell him to put them away, and boom, just like that, you're a scold. While being a scold wasn't a crime, it was criminally punishable, and they had quite a few imaginative and funky ways in which to do so, such as a scold's bridle, which is an iron cagelet or mouth that encases the mouth exterior and interior, ensuring that the woman's mouth opens or even her tongue moves. Metal spikes would lacerate and puncture her. Sometimes they would even add insult to injury by parading the woman around town in the bridle to face scorn, or by chaining her to a fireplace where she could inhale ash and soot and desperately try not to cough lest she gets the bridle's spikes. There was also a yoke, a type of wooden restraint that could either hold 1 or 2 people. A woman could be made to wear one alone, sent walking for hours under the disproportionate weight as a punishment, or she might be locked up with the woman she was fighting with, in which case you don't have the discomfort of the weight, but you do have the discomfort of staring at your rival's ugly mug for a while. Doing the do and when to comes in at number 1. In medieval times, there were numerous religious laws enacted that aimed to restrict the act of reproduction and the times in which it could be done. In a 7-day week, a married couple could only engage 4 of the days. Thursday and Fridays were no-no days, as people were supposed to prepare for the Holy Communion, and Sunday as well, because it was the Lord's Day. In a year itself, the 47 to 62 days of Lent, and then the 40 to 60 days of the Feast of Pentecost, relations were prohibited. For the 35 days leading up to Christmas, it was also banned. Anyways, medieval folks considered the eyes important in regards to a person's sexual appetite, so it was also encouraged not to make eye contact during banned periods with someone if you're attracted to them. That I can actually kinda get. It is a romance movie trope after all. Anyways, outside of a religious factor, abstinence during Lent ensured no babies would be born during winter time periods when food was scarce and it was harder to endure pregnancy. First up, since we've heard a decent bit about nights before, let's start with training day, or days, well, years. The joke still landed, whatever. Training for knights began around age 7, and it would take an average of 14 years before they were ready to battle. Essentially like going to middle and high school today. And like the school system, you moved up through the levels. Potential knights started as pages, who essentially acted as an assistant or servant to their assigned lord. Most of the training for pages began practicing with dull weapons, learning to master riding a horse, take part in hunts, and otherwise do menial tasks. At 14, pages would become squires, assuming they were still in good physical health and not a raging socio or psychopath. According to medieval Britain, once a page became a squire, he had to master the 7 points of agilities, which was just a really long list of sporting events. So things like shooting, fencing, wrestling, riding horses, swimming and diving, climbing, long jumping, tournaments, sports like jousting, and dancing. Okay, so that's more than 7 points of agilities, and dancing was in there, so let's just agree that medieval logic was a bit strange and their math skills were bad, and we can move on. After approximately 5 to 7 years of this higher training, if they survived and had mastered all the required skills, they'd usually be officially knighted, and that's usually at age 19 to 22. You weren't taught to have your own opinions, but people are people, and that's why sometimes a knight had to battle their conscience. allegiance. As a knight, you were serving God. But what did that mean? A knight could go his whole life without having the clouds overhead opening up and God sticking his head through to yell specific directions at him out of everyone on earth to choose from. So he had to turn elsewhere for guidance. Okay, so what do we got here? Well, there's the priest, or you could ask the king, who by virtue was a direct mouthpiece of God, which by the way is super convenient to be packing when you want to do things like seduce courtiers or chop off people's heads. God said I could, haha. But this also means a knight is always beholden to kings and that mouthpiece of his. Whether or not the orders agreed with the knight's conscience, the orders came from God and he was dedicated to that God. So what happened to knights who disobeyed that or somehow dishonored themselves? The ones who the king hits up and said, yo, I'm gonna have your wife tonight, or go execute this blind person for bumping into me, and their response was anything other than, oh yeah man, do whatever you want. Well, a king gave the knight his spurs so he could also take them away. According to noble dynasty, when a knight who did something treasonous or cowardly, correct, was just accused of doing something treasonly or cowardly because there didn't have to be proof, he got publicly stripped of knighthood in a formal ceremony, then executed. And seeing as being a knight meant that could happen at any second, X marks the plot. There must have been those knights with existentialism, the ones who laid up at night wondering if all the infidel killing and pervy chivalry and pillaging and holy calling stuff, what if it's almost but not enough to get you into heaven? Which means you could do pretty much everything right as a knight and still spend sleepless nights worrying that you wouldn't make it past the pearly gates. They were a super religious lot after all. In anticipation of solving this problem, a lot of knights, well, those who made it past their youth anyway, would often join a military order because membership usually came with a plot in a church graveyard. And seeing as they believed even people who were completely without sin could not be guaranteed a place in heaven unless they were buried in a certain kind of dirt, that's better than a pension. And no, not any dirt would do. It had to be consecrated dirt of a church graveyard. According to ancient history encyclopedia, an aging knight would sometimes even enlist at the last possible second for battle so he could be interred beneath a lovely stone effigy in church forever without needing to do or spend any time doing boring churchy stuff. Our world loves class divide, and that's no different back then, when it sucked to be a poor knight. On that note, contrary to popular belief, not all knights were wealthy with castles and serfs and all that bougie middle-age luxury. In fact, some weren't even landowners at all, and the rank of knight was more or less something that made one a minor noble, like your auntie on city council. Though, of course, many among the knighted held higher positions in nobility separate from their knightly status. This is to do with knighthood becoming a nepo baby industry. The lowest class of these knights might even live in their lords' homes, serving more or less as bodyguards, security, occasionally law enforcement, and sometimes judges, mediating local disputes. In essence, their day-to-day was a bit of a mashup between soldier and civil law enforcement. It's like those people you met who wanted to become a cop for the fast action and the pew-pew and the speed chases, then learn it's 80% paperwork and painfully slow regiment. As you might imagine, lower ranked and poorer knights love tournaments for a chance to gain prestige, practice their skills, and the chance to acquire additional wealth via prizes and ransoms and the like. So, tournaments is next on our list, because they were essentially medieval mud melees. Since knights started at not-nosed kids, it was easy to build the ideology of tournaments as fun and exciting into them, the foundation of competitiveness. In the 13th century, tournaments were particularly bloody and death was not uncommon. Initially, the games and tournaments were a little more than massive melees, usually including real sharpened weapons. There were no rules, and tensions were made intensely high because often they'd group the knights by nation or clan, then pit them against each other that way. Call whoever had that idea Taylor Swift because they wanted bad blood. That said, the general point, unlike real battle, was not to intentionally kill your opponent, but just to knock them off their horse, steal their armor and horse, and take them prisoner until the tourney is over. That being said, dull weapons weren't introduced into tournaments for hundreds of years, and they also used lances to launch each other off of horses at full speed, so realistically death is inevitable. One notable tournament took place in 1274 when King Edward I was pitted against the Count of Chalons. As the king and the count battled it out, dozens of soldiers from each side got involved and lost their lives. And these tournaments often took up whole villages. This is because they weren't much different from actual battle, so knights could take off and hide in a peasant's house from the opposing team, which was often then ransacked and burnt. Essentially, being a medieval peasant was like living in Avengers Universe New York, where at any second your whole house could be obliterated in a blink and you miss it style by a group of battling morons.
Number 5, garbage stew. Ever walk down the stairs and say, "Mom, what's for dinner?" And she says, I don't know, but pulls off whatever she's got from the fridge and the pantry and makes a great meal. Even though deep down inside, she hasn't been grocery shopping because she got into the wine, but acted as if she had everything under control when she totally didn't. Shout out to all the moms out there who do great work. You're the best. Way to go, moms. Well, that's what medieval garbage stew was, minus the whole mom part. It's a little bit of everything and anything and everything that's left over. Guts, chicken feet, leftover salt, spices, if any were available, livers. You get the point. It's kind of gross, but at some point, after trial and error, you'd probably come up with something delicious. Enough garlic and broth, maybe a little bit more kitty. Throw in some sheep gabagool while you're at it. Why not? You know? Number 4, helmeted chicken. Working 9 to 5 is hard. It takes tough people, both blue and white collar folks with grit to wake up every morning and get the job done for their families. This is true of peasantry in medieval times. It was tough, but someone had to do it. So imagine, if you would, how you would feel after grueling days of work in the fields, defending your farm from foreign invaders and maintaining a family. That's a tall order. After all that, you find out that royalty have been having extravagant dinners and meals and having meat every meal, which is kind of rare for peasants. It wasn't that common. Not only are they having meat, but they're having multiple types of meat at the same dinner, and on top of that, they're sewing poultry on top of pigs to make it look like it was a knight in a coat of arms riding into battle. Just like a turducken, because they're bored, and that's what a helmeted chicken was. Boredom. Crazy. People are starving outside and they're like, we should sew the chicken and the pig together. Number 3, humble pie. I'll cut the brass tacks on this one. I've never had venison before, but I hear it's good. I'm willing to try it. I like trying new things. Then I can say no, you know? However, the entrails of a deer and other wild animals baked into a pie, that I'm not too sure of. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm thinking about a big greasy chef who's using his bare hands, which most likely haven't been washed, and he's pounding guts into the pie like a jackhammer. The sounds, the smells, and well, it just doesn't taste good in my imagination. However, this one was quite common. It was a very common dish in medieval times. I don't know why, but it was. Can you imagine eating a entrail pie? Oh, that must be awful. Number 2, chicken beer. This one's great. You guys are gonna love this one. Beer, the elixir of life. It's how Homer Simpson functions, and honestly, I don't blame him. It makes sports fun and watching reality TV shows when you're forced to enjoyable. Beer is no modern invention, and its hoppy roots can be found in ancient times. However, the Middle Ages were no different. There's lots of beer back then. Thank God. However, let's take a look at a different recipe, if you will. This one includes raisins, mace, nutmeg, dates, and a boiled chicken beaten like a tough cut of meat. All of these ingredients were then put into a canvas bag and left to steep until fermentation took place. Now, doesn't that sound like you just want to pop the caps of a couple of those bad boys? Boiled chicken beer? Yes, please. More like no thanks. That sounds awful. Boiled chicken beer, goddamn. And coming in the number 1 spot today, we have lamprey. Wait till the editor pulls up a picture of these bad boys. Hideous, ugly fish with lots of little sharp teeth around a suction cup mouth, perfect for sucking blood. They're bloodsuckers. While you cover up your wrist, medieval people love these little devils. This was also thought of as a delicacy. King Henry I loved them so much, in fact, well, it actually might have been his undoing. He ate too many of them, apparently. Gross. Stay off the leeches, guys. If anything, stay off the leeches. They're gross. Don't. No.
Kicking off our list at number 10, rat poison. Yeah, this one's pretty gross right off the hop. During the 16th century, it was common to fill your house with arsenic trioxide to keep rats from your food supply, right? You don't want those guys hanging around. They're bringing the plague in, a little nasty. Barbara Gilbert of Leicestershire, she thought that she was grabbing flour and ended up mixing this stuff with milk. That was a really bad mistake. She thought she was preparing a meal for her family when really she was about to poison them. Now, it's horrible to say, but Barbara, she took a sip, thankfully, before her family, and then she was thankfully the only person who lost their life because of this, poison that they made. It's tragic, but it could have been much, much worse. Everyone dying because of a rat poison plague? That's pretty horrible. But it happened again in 1599 when Margaret Morland thought she was giving her husband ale. Really, it was arsenic trioxide and water, aka not ale. God, that would really suck. What a horrible mishap. Number 9, famine. Back in medieval times, food supplies solely relied on good weather and proper harvests, and obviously lack of rats definitely helps. If the seasons were dry, people of course starved. More often than not, common folk would survive on rations of berries, corn, and wheat. Now the lack of food of course led to disease. Now if they didn't starve to death, illnesses like tuberculosis, smallpox, typhoid, influenza, and mumps often did the trick. The Great Famine of the early 14th century was historically awful. Between 1315 and 1322, it rained for 150 days at a time. That's a lot of water. Western Europe was a mess. These conditions took the lives of 15% of England. Farmers couldn't plant or harvest crops, and the winters during these years were historically bad as well. Insane rainfalls and severe freezing. We're still struggling to adapt to weather changes today, but imagine the Dark Ages. Weather sucked every day. It was horrible. Number 8. Weather Witch. Aside from that little ice age I just referenced, what was the weather like for most of these medieval travelers? 5 seasons of Game of Thrones. They talked about winter coming, but what were those winters really like? People in the 1400s believed that bad weather could be caused by the behavior of wicked people, like killers, those who sin, incest, that was a pretty bad one. Game of Thrones would have been screwed off the hop. That would have been a lot of horrible weather. Even family arguments were to blame. You talk back to your mom, next thing you know, the crops are frozen. Nice, way to go, Eric. It's on you. Now this eventually linked back to blaming witches or sorcerers who some believe could control the crops and or weather. Yeah, sorcerers controlling your crops, imagine that. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486, this book straight up references a witch that would fly in the air and create storms. Yeah, with effects that took lives of animals and farmers. No thanks, I'm glad we don't have any of those floating about. We just have drones now, which are just as annoying. Number 7, Jesus take the wheel. With witches to blame for hailstorms, who do we turn to fight the powers of evil, right? How do we get some goddamn crops back in the game? From the 14th to the 16th century, the ice pack grew around the world. Weather was changing in a drastic way, and by 1550, there had been an expansion of glaciers worldwide. Everyone thought that it was witches causing it. It's like, no, just plain old science. Back then, the general public didn't know what was happening. They didn't have Neil deGrasse Tyson explaining the phenomenon on a podcast. So people in the medieval times would perform rituals for harvesting crops in hopes that something would change. There would be special prayers, charms, beautiful services, all to ensure proper weather and fertility of the fields. Certain saints, like historical saints, they were believed to protect against harsh conditions. To protect us from the frost, we had Saint Servais, and to shield us from the winds, we had Saint Clement. And to fight back against drought and the rains, we had the one and only Saint Elijah, or Elijah. The power of the saints and the Virgin Mary were believed to protect against storms and lightning, so that's like the medieval version of the Avengers, I guess. 'Tis the season. Thank you, Saint Mary. Let's keep it dry. Canada has a huge storm coming tonight, so could use some of that saint power ASAP. Number 6, violence. Imagine going outside in medieval times. Is it dangerous? Is it lonely? Is it full of criminals? What's it like? What were those odds like just to get home? Street violence and brawls in taverns were as common as they are today. And like we saw a few times in Game of Thrones, peasants got a bit fed up from time to time. Yeah, can't imagine why, huh? Vassals would revolt against their lords. This happened historically a few times. The rebellion of peasants in Flanders, this went down in 1323, and then 60 years later, England saw the peasants revolt in 1381. A lot of peasants getting fed up. Yeah, I would assume. I'm surprised it took that long, really.
In our number 5 spot today, we have the Italian Renaissance dark side. Just at the tail end of the years of the medieval period, as we transitioned into the Renaissance period, began the Italian Renaissance. When we think of the Italian Renaissance period, it is known for the development and the rebirth that it caused, which makes a lot of sense considering the word Renaissance means rebirth. But there is one less glamorous and slightly frightening side to this period that isn't always spoken about. Sailors who had been returning from the New World at this point brought something less than lovely back with them, and that was syphilis, which spread through an entire French army. After this, the troops brought what was called the Great Pox to the rest of Europe. Since there was no penicillin back then, the disease spread rapidly and the symptoms were pretty gruesome. It would often happen that the person who had fallen ill would have the skin on their faces essentially be rotting away, which would leave large ulcers. Sometimes people's noses or lips would be pretty much gone, and it happened often that people would very sadly pass away from the disease. So basically, what we think of as a really beautiful time in Europe was both world-changing but also very scary and, like, I don't know, kinda close to a zombie apocalypse. In our number 4 spot today, we have William the Conqueror. In 1087, William the Conqueror decided to take on an all-alcohol diet. This is because he was suffering from extreme obesity and was struggling because because of that fact. Because of this, he told his staff that he would only drink wine until his weight went down, but he ended up passing away less than a year later, and most of us are told that obviously this was because of the wine-only diet. That's actually not true. In an astonishing turn of events, this wine-only diet actually worked. Shortly after beginning his diet, he was able to ride his horse again, which was one of the main reasons he started the diet in the first place, as he was previously too heavy for the horse to carry. He actually died after falling from his horse during an expedition, which was completely unrelated to either his weight or his diet. It's entirely possible that had he not gone on this diet, he would have never ridden his horse and maybe would have lived longer? Truthfully, who knows? But I suppose in a very roundabout way, he did still kind of die from his wine-only diet. In our number 3 spot today, we have Olga of Kiev. Olga of Kiev became queen regent in 945 CE after her husband was killed, and during the time her son was too young to rule just yet. Olga knew that once her son was old enough to be crowned king, her power would be taken away, so she needed to see her wishes carried out before that happened. Her wishes included the capturing and killing of those who took the life of her husband, which was carried out by using scalding hot water. Yeah. Don't even want to imagine what that would have been like. Don't kill the king, I guess. Historically, it really doesn't seem to work out well. Apparently, in doing this, however, Olga developed a bit of a bloodthirst, and she would not rest until everyone associated with the people who killed her husband were all eliminated. It seemed like if you even looked in the wrong direction or breathed in the vicinity of someone who had something to do with the king's slaying, you could kiss your own life goodbye. Olga took hundreds of people out of the tribe that the killers were from. She devised a plan to bury the tribe leaders alive, and she even came up with a plan to set fire to their entire village. It is said that Olga may have locked the tribe's leaders in a bathhouse and burned it down, but we don't know for sure. All we do know is that she definitely was not okay. In our number 2 spot today, we have Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a deputy to the ruler of the Mali Empire, but when the ruler went missing while on a sea voyage to find the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, Mansa Musa became the ruler in 1312. During his rule, European nations were really struggling due to civil wars and a lack of resources, but the Mali Empire was flourishing because of their abundance of resources like gold and salt. Under his rule, the empire grew to take up a large portion of West Africa as he conquered 24 cities and their surrounding districts. At this time, Mali was one of the top producers of gold in the entire world, which left Mansa Musa as one of the wealthiest historical figures ever. One of the most well-known events during his rule was the pilgrimage to Mecca. This journey took place from 1324 to 1325 and spanned an estimated 4,000 miles, and it was the first time people outside of the empire saw just how wealthy he was. He traveled with 60,000 of his men, all wearing Persian silk, along with 12,000 slaves who each carried 4 pounds of gold bars, and he also brought heralds who had golden staffs, along with a bunch of camels and horses. This pilgrimage had a profound effect on Egypt as this huge group of people passed through. From the markets in Cairo to the royals to the impoverished people that crossed their path, Musa left Cairo littered with so much gold that it depreciated the value of the metal in Egypt, and it took decades for them to recover. In our number 1 spot today, we have St. Marcellus's flood. This was actually a very serious extratropical cyclone that swept through around January 16th, 1362. This cyclone eerily matched up with the new moon, and it spanned through the British Isles, the Netherlands, northern Germany, and Denmark. Here's the thing, this storm not only lined up with the moon, but also peaked on the feast day of St. Marcellus, which is the reason it got its name, but usually people refer to this one as the second, because there is another. The first St. Marcellus flood took the lives of 36,000 people as it swept through the northern Netherlands in 1219. The second flood, however, while no one is sure the exact numbers, it is estimated that at least 250,000 people lost their lives. While there have been plenty of devastating floods in history, this one is said to be blamed on Atlantic gales, and that this event goes hand in hand with the Great Wind of 1362.
Number 10. Andrew, is this you? There is no lighter way to put this. We talked about a court jester or a fool, but did you know that some medieval royal courts had professional farters? Yes, that's people whose sole purpose in life was to fart. I'm still trying to figure out how Andrew can fart on command, but these guys did it as a job. These guys would fart their way to being rewarded with houses and lands for their fartscapades. Fartscapades that would include passing their intestinal wind in unique, creative, musical, or amusing ways. I wonder if the mic picked that up. This quote I found from St. Augustine in City of God says, these talented individuals had, quote unquote, such a command of their bowels that they can break wind continuously at will so as to produce the effect of singing. The most famous of the medieval flatulists, no that's not a joke, that's actually what they're called, was Roland the Farter from Hemmingstone Manor in the county of Suffolk, England. In the 12th century, who could shoot water up to 5 feet. He could squirt water out of his bum while farting.
Ready?
Want some water?
Number 9, arranged marriages. Today, the marriage industry makes millions every year. Flowers, design, and of course, the bridal dresses. It's a good business, especially once the weather starts to warm up. You got options today, ladies. Sleeves or no sleeves, veil or no veil, and thousands of other dress designs that I simply just don't understand. But the beauty of it all is that you get to marry the man of your dreams. Hi. I'm not the man of their dreams, let's be honest. Or at least the best smelling one in your social circle. Definitely not me. However, for the ladies of the past, they sometimes didn't get to pick their man as her family or royal court would. A lot of marriages, especially on the high-ups, were often more of a political move than that of a romantic one. Sure, marrying for an alliance sounds cool, but man, dinner time would be like a blind date every night. That's just super awkward. So like where are you from? What's going on? Yeah.
Number 8, keys to the city. You know when people say that someone got the keys to the city as a way of saying that person can do whatever they want? Well, that came from the medieval times. You see, back in ye olden times, if you lived in a walled city, when nighttime hit, they locked those gates up tight. Don't want some slimy bandits, enemy soldiers, or unwanted flatulists coming and going in the city in the dead of the night. Someone who was particularly well liked or who had done something noteworthy to gain the respect, trust, and admiration of the people would be given a key to the city, giving them the free reign to come and go as they please. We actually still do this, but obviously most cities don't really have walls anymore, so it's more of a symbolic thing, like, hey, you're great, have this little key that opens literally nothing. You're welcome.
Number 7, graveyards. If you're like me, then you've seen enough zombie movies to know that hanging around a graveyard is the last place you want to be. It's their spawn point, duh. And every time you drive by a graveyard, you think to yourself, some zombie related thoughts, but dare not tell anyone for fear of sounding like a weird guy for talking about zombies rising out of the graves because it's sunny out and that just sounds like a Tale from the Crypt episode. Well, medieval people didn't have fears of George A. Romero's movies or that weird corpse guy in Tales of the Crypt Keeper, as people like to hang out in the graveyards. Weird, I know. In medieval times, they were just a part of the town. There weren't really a lot of fences or like barriers. Sometimes there would be plays, small festivals, and even shops set up in graveyards since graveyard shops pay no tax.
I guess you could say shop till you drop.
All bad impressions aside, I'll stay away, especially with the diseases going around back then.
Number 6, cat burning.
Excuse me, Emma.
Medieval people just hated cats. A lot of the ye old people thought cats were symbols or allies of the big red with the horns. And yeah, they aren't the most pleasant of animals, but I love my cat.
Yeah.
Not that one. Unfortunately, in the Middle Age France, it was custom to burn a barrel full of live cats over a burning fire every Midsummer's Eve, as people shrieked with laughter and danced around with glee. French kings often witnessed it and even ceremoniously started the fire. But they did much more than that too, like King Charles IX, who threw a live fox onto the fire for added variety. Or in 1648, France's King Louis XIV, then aged just 10, lit the tinder on a large bonfire in central Paris, then watched and danced with glee as a basket of stray cats was lowered into the flames. A man who wrote to his brother about the celebration of coronation of Queen Elizabeth I wrote, "Last Saturday, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth was solemnized in the city with mighty bonfires and the burning of a most costly pope, carried by 4 persons in diverse clothing, his belly filled full of live cats, who squalled most hideously as soon as they felt the fire." What the hell?
But sometimes you can say I do and have a whole ceremony and still have to prove it. In the Middle Ages, getting married was easy for Christians living in Western Europe. According to the church, which created and enforced marriage law, couples didn't need permission of their families or priests to officiate until towards the end of the 18th century. And though the church controlled or tried to control marriage, couples didn't need to marry in a church until the 18th century. So, medieval legal records show people getting married on the road, down at the pub, at a friend's house, in bed, really anywhere. All that was required for a valid binding marriage was the consent of the two people involved. So, while tying the knot can take a matter of moments, proving you were married is a different story. The vast majority of marriage cases that came up before the courts were to enforce or prove that a marriage had been taken place in the first place. And marriage mix-ups bothered the clergy since, after much debate, theologians decided in the 12th century that marriage was a holy sacrament. The union of man and woman in marriage and intercourse represented the union of Christ in the church, and this was hardly symbolism to be taken lightly now. So they wrote up some laws and dished them out. The statutes issued by the English Church in 1217 to 1219 include warnings such as no man should place a ring of reeds or another material, vile or precious, onto young woman's hands in jest, so that he might more easily fornicate with them. Lest he thinks himself to be joking, he pledge himself to the burden of matrimony. Another thing in those statutes was hold that peace. Not your pee though, I know it sounded similar, but you can do that on the streets anywhere. It's medieval times. Beautiful. Anywho, the bonds I mentioned earlier were introduced as part of the 1215 changes to try and flush out any impediments before a marriage took place. This could be someone is already married, or she's not a virgin, or he's wanted for killing someone. There's range. Nevertheless, until the Reformation, there was no speak now or forever hold your peace. In the Middle Ages, problems discovered or revealed after marriage could have an enormous impact still. For example, Joan of Kent, who's remembered as Edward the Black Prince's wife and the mother of the future King Richard II, was married in her early teens. It was a whole Diana-level spectacle with full publicity, a church service, her new boo was an aristocrat, but after about 8 years of marriage, this marriage was overturned in the papal court, and she was returned to a knight she had secretly married without her family's knowledge or approval when she was 12. Imagine that, spend 8 years with a dude only to be shipped back to some idiot I said I love you to when you were 12. If that still happened nowadays, we'd all be locked in with our first crushes. Take a minute please and soak that horrible thought in. Anyways, it's difficult to know how many medieval people married for love or found love in their arranged marriage. There was certainly a distinction between free consent to marry and having a completely free choice. Now circling back to my earlier point where I explained the wedding day, how about the wedding night? Not a moment alone is next. Alright, y'all have officially tied the knot and locked lips for the first time. You did some praying, now it's time for a meal. Pretty normal stuff that lines up with nowadays. The peasant couples celebrated with their friends and family, drinking bridal ale for this special occasion and eating a meal traditionally made up of dishes brought by the wedding guests to help feed the community. That's right y'all, like a trailer park wedding, medieval receptions were potlucks. After the reception, a peasant couple may dance and enjoy their night, but a royal couple is ushered to the chamber to consummate the marriage in bed ASAP. The priest, the clergy, parents, really whoever wanted in on the action would come into the room, kick their feet up, and have some popcorn and tell the couple, give us a show here. The bride needed to be a virgin at the time too, which had to be proven by blood being on the bed sheets. If there wasn't any, the whole wedding could be undone on the spot, which actually would be really hard for those women who don't bleed their first times. They do exist. And of course, because there isn't enough people in the room while your cherry's getting popped as is, a medieval wedding tradition allowed unmarried guests from the procession to also follow royal newlyweds into the room and take turns throwing the bride and groom stockings at them. Whoever managed to make a direct hit would presumably get married soon. Yeah, this is where the bouquet toss comes from. Then someone has to go retrieve it off the naked sweaty couple so someone else can have a throw. Truly a magical time of wedding traditions. Imposed witnesses, parental consent, church weddings. Yes, it was because of the confusing I do issue and a bunch of others I've listed, but it was also because of kidnap. So, over the last 20 years, historians have increasingly problematized consent we've heard of in the past, warning us not to project modern understanding of consent onto that medieval canon law. Today, consent is defined by what is present instead of what is absent. Yes means yes instead of no means no. In medieval times, the gap between coercion and consent was essentially a hairline. Women didn't have many legal options to deal with very persuasive or dangerous men who demanded their hand and would stop at nothing to achieve it, and consequently, the women often agreed to marry them for fear of their life. Because stopping at nothing often led to being captured, and with women being property, if said captor managed to return home and take the woman against her will before a brother, father, knight, whoever can do something about it, she becomes his property. These abductions then regularly end in marriage because of the damage of the deflowering caused to the victim's reputation. She'd never be wanted by anyone else, and so the POS who can't understand the word no wins. To delineate between consent and coercion, canon laws dropped in the 1200s stated that the degree of pressure applied on an individual could not sway a constant man or woman, meaning that neither family members, romantic partner, a stranger, anyone could exert pressure on an individual to force their consent. However, the degree to which force is interpreted and is defined by each city or community. Some communities stay stuck in old ways. And last but never the least is apparently you can be too into your wife. So, marriage aside from being a means of property exchange was also used by the church to regulate adult activities and carnal desires of the everyday person. Because any intercourse outside of marriage was a universal sin, but intercourse in marriage is only acceptable for procreation. Which means the church is trying to peddle that a good intimacy relationship was beneficial to your marriage, but neither desire nor pleasure should be involved or play a role in it, because that's physically possible. They took this serious too, man. Like, Thomas Aquinas warned that a man who slept with his wife solely for pleasure was treating her like a lady of the night, and St. Jerome stated in the 4th century that a man who is too passionately in love with his wife is an adulterer. This is a sentiment which remained prevalent up until the end of the 16th century. Not only was the purpose of intercourse within marriage made abundantly clear by the church, and still is, but there were many rules and regulations pertaining to the act itself, like when the activity between the husband or wife was or wasn't permitted. That would be like a feast or fast day, Sundays, menstruation or pregnancy, while breastfeeding, and for 40 days after childbirth, also holidays, and holy days. This meant that on average, most married couples could legally have intercourse less than once a week. -1 time a week, you guys. But at least we had champs like Albert the Great who would throw ladies the proverbial bone every now and then. He defended women's carnal desires during pregnancy, actually, in a document, claiming that the fetus stimulated desire in women. A woman never desires relations so much as she does when she is pregnant. Medicine is most needed in the time of greatest illness.
Number 10, the Dancing Plague. It was a normal summer day in 1518 Strasbourg when all of a sudden patient zero began to twitch and move in a way that was so peculiar. No, this isn't the start of a medieval zombie movie, which actually sounds pretty cool. This was a plague like no other, the Dancing Plague. A dancing woman shortly began to gather a crowd, and more people seemed to strangely dance. More people joined in, and then it became the Dancing Plague, which lasted for days, strangely. Some were taken in for medical treatment for the strange behavior. Today, no one is really sure what happened. Some think it was the devil's work. Scientists today think it could have been a mold-induced psychotic incident, and other people think it could be just classic medieval hysteria. However, I like to think it was John Taverner's newest mixtape.
Number 9. Rushed wedding. Not all marriages back in the medieval times were for political and strategic gain. Some of it was actually for love. And some of it was extremely spontaneous. There wasn't even an official ceremony for a long time, and if you wanted to get married, the two of you just had to both give verbal consent, which is always a good idea. As you can imagine, this meant a lot of people would be getting legally bonded to each other in the streets, at the pubs, and while together in bed, which, taking into account that people were considered old enough for marriage at obscenely young ages, they were not really thinking with their brains right then. But hey, life was short and love was fiery. But because of this, it was kind of hard to prove the whole thing, so we came up with a lovely way of confirming the whole situation.
Number 8, Splash Zone. Let's get it on. Ooh, 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 babe, let's get it on. Ooh! Man, I love that song. I love the classics. You know, sometimes those moments in life require that special soundtrack. Like when I'm gaming, I love synth pop. When I party, I'm a man who enjoys some Drake. How you doing, buddy? And when it's time to get low, I like the official soundtrack of Shrek. What can I say? Cinematic masterpiece. That being said, that's all that needs to happen in those intimate moments. For medieval times and in many places around the world, people would have to watch the signing off of the marriage. This included friends, family, local leaders, and maybe some nobility. You know, just to make sure the marriage went through properly. Gee, honey, I can't wait to go home and consummate the marriage. I figure if everyone shows up at 8, they can leave by 8:05. Maybe 8:02. Just stay out of the splash zone.
Number 7. Men's fashion. By far, one of the best ways to show that you are not one of the lowly plebeians back in medieval times would be your clothes. We've talked about how stripes were the pattern of the devil, but they had some weirder trends back in the Middle Ages. For example, long and pointy shoes were a very big sign of wealth, and the longer and pointier the shoe, the more gold pieces were lining your pocket. Men loved to show off their bodies back then too, but they didn't have BMWs back in the day, so one way a dude could compensate for himself was the aptly named codpiece, which was a pouch attached to the front of a man's pantaloons, perfectly shaped and padded to display their masculinity. It's like that one dad at the beach wearing the Speedo, except maybe a little less nightmare-inducing.
Number 6, hairless. Nobody wants to go bald, just ask Jada Smith. Medieval times had different thoughts about this, however. Not only was a receding hairline normal, but that was the thing for ladies at the time. You might be thinking it's all about the waist, the legs, or the booty. Well, not back then. So, if the forehead is all the rage, focus on it, right? Makes sense. How is this done? Well, you can start by plucking those lashes. Don't need those. Then pluck the eyebrows. Ain't gonna need those either. And just start reeling back that hairline. Oh, perfect. Now you're ready for a night on the town. The history of women's fashion and traditions is a story of pain, beauty, and some really weird choices.
Losing your life can suck, but so can losing your gear, because knights buy their own armor. The biggest barrier to entry for those who are peasants or serf turned knight was the absurdly high cost of equipment. Remember, this was centuries before governments decided to arm their troops for combat. You want to be blessed by the divine right to be controlled by me, the king, your whole life, and have no freedom, property, life, money, individualism of your own, only to die stupidly in a field somewhere? Well, you also need to buy your own armor. Being a knight was a fat ripoff. Mostly you were paid in land ownership, or sometimes just by the glory of your lord. And that's because the system benefited noblemen who grew up in it, not much different from how things work nowadays. So any armor or weapons you needed had to be purchased on the side. With money, you were never given. It's no problem for the knights of noble birth, but other knights would have to work the land and sell goods just to earn enough. Yes, it is also a tin can, and it's one size only. Have fun rebuying pieces when weight fluctuates. One outlier though is new research and digital recreations show that knights were actually able to tumble, climb, chop wood, jump on horses, and run quite easily all in armor. So if you're scared of never being able to fit in again, never get out of it. Not like they washed much anyways. And while it can keep you safe, it can put a target on your back too. Held for ransom is next. And if you've ever watched a movie such as Gladiator, Braveheart, 300, Troy, to name a few, then you may recall that some dudes always wore special armor during battle, and some wore none. If you were rich enough or important enough, you could have the best of the best armor, made of the strongest but lightest materials to gain a defensive edge on the battlefield, all at the low price of your daddy's money. And it wasn't exclusive to any kingdom, so that means in one moment for everyone battling one another, knights realized that if they saw opponents in incredibly strong or elaborate armor, not to kill that guy, but keep him. Captured instead, a ransom could be demanded for a nobleman knight, because only well-off knights wore such good armor, so that's what you get for flashing your stack, I guess. Worst case Ontario, if the ransom doesn't work out and none of your boys are as sizes 12 as 88s in tin seam, you can melt them down for some pieces of your own. Hey, what sucked more than the medieval knight? Being married to one. Like so many of the sickest jobs in history, being a knight was exclusively reserved for the owners of a ding-a-ling. Their wives were expected to sit at home, not learning to kill people with a broadsword or pile driving her buddies into a pile of dung, their bloodlust going offensively unsatiated. Unless their husband died like a moron, that is. In that case, in a very un-Middle Ages twist, women were expected to fulfill all their husband's knightly duties. This included protecting their new lord and making sure his land didn't fall into disrepair. Only women didn't get any of the cool stuff that came with it, like respect or equality or acknowledgement by history. They got armor though, which is pretty sick. Unsurprisingly, the wives seldom waited for their husbands to get gored by a lance before getting all up in the business of running the show. He could literally drop at any time, so homegirl had to be ready. This resulted in knight wives actually being significantly more skilled and diplomatically inclined than their husbands. The duties generally expected of a knight's wife included everything from organizing the defenses of their state to arranging marriages for their servants. This was on top of being at beck and call for their husbands 24 hours a day. I wonder how many of these men really met their ends of their own accord, and how many met their end when she didn't need him anymore. It has the effect Taco Bell has on the average 21st century person. Dentistry. Dentistry is a disease caused by tainted tainted food and drink, causing intestinal inflammation leading to excessively frequent and uncontrollable diarrhea to the point of death. So yeah, Taco Bell. Generally, no one was safe. A fact 15th century Italian polymath Girolamo Savonarola made clear when he observed that dentistry affected not only in the same house, but in the entire locale, and moving from a child of 10 or 15 to a sexagenarian. Savonarola himself came down with the disease in 1495. Now this included knights. Battling knights. On English invasion of France, King Henry II had brought a well-trained and disciplined army who were riddled with this disease. The tough-tested veterans could handle the fever and the fatigue, but the constant loss of bowel control presented a massive stinky problem on the eve of an already ominous battle. So, the English set up their position on one side of a narrow field, which lay between two forested areas. The narrow approach allowed the limited number of men-at-arms to stretch across the front, while the archers took stationary positions on the flanks angled inward with a row of protective stakes in front. Thanks to their stationary positions, the archers suffering from dentistry simply dropped their pants and shot their arrows. They also dipped their arrows in it to add insult to injury as the world's worst psychological and bio-warfare duo. I mean, can you imagine an arrow covered in that flying at you? Yeah, they won. By a lot. And topping our list is a reminder that our mental well-being is not solely a thing of the present. It's PTSD. From crime statistics and letters of pardons, historians can see that people in the Middle Ages were no more violent than we are today. And yes, they exercised it in its most extreme forms, but this violence was not through nature nor culture, rather simple direction. Whilst following their orders, those battle experiences could leave them with a very serious case of PTSD. This is backed up by a book that was actually written by a knight who lived in the first half of the 14th century. His name was Garreth Arenburg-Duchesne, and he was one of the most respected knights of his age. The book about the life of a knight actually includes the psychological consequences. These symptoms ring true of PTSD. In his book, Duchesne advises knights on how to relate to the fact that they must kill people when they are at war, how to mentally endure the hardships knights face, poor sleep, hunger, emotional numbness, loneliness, and a feeling that even nature is going against them. Modern military psychology enables us to read medieval texts like these, or ones of Egypt or Greek battles and the Mongol spread, all in a new way, giving us insight into the perception of violence in the Middle Ages in the general population. In history, we've had a horrible habit of misinterpreting. Easy mistake as inflection doesn't appear on paper, or stone tablets. Previously, medieval texts were read as worshipping heroes and glorifying violence, but in the light of modern military psychology, we can see the mental cost to knights and of their participation in the gruesome and extreme violent wars in the Middle Ages.